All right, welcome everybody to this afternoon at Chalmers on the topic of QUO VADIS AI ethics. Please note that the meeting is being recorded. I think the best way to organize questions and so on is that we will have a short Q&A at the end of each talk, and feel free to use the chat during the talk to pose questions, and then I can invite you during the Q&A to formulate the questions, and at that point you can turn on your microphones, but otherwise please stay muted during the talks. We have 3 talks and one concluding panel discussion scheduled. We have a slight change to the schedule. There's no times will be changed, but we had a late cancellation for health reasons from Charlotte Stix, who was meant to give the second talk jointly with Matthijs Maas, but Matthijs has kindly offered to give that talk by himself. So we're looking forward to that. Our other speakers are Markus Anderljung, who will go first, and Mohammed Abdalla, who will go third. And in the end, we will have a panel discussion with all the speakers and chaired by Moa Johansson. So the overall topic here is where the topic of AI ethics ought to be heading in order to improve the chances that future developments and deployment of artificial intelligence turns out well for people and for society, and how best to organize work in AI ethics in order to make this happen. I was hoping to have Markus Anderljung, our first speaker, in the room, but he doesn't seem to be here just yet. I'm going to just very quickly check my email and see. Nothing from him there. All right. Since he is not present, and since, of course, everybody is planning to attend all 3 talks anyway, I think we can allow ourselves to permute the program, provided that Matthijs is ready to move up his talk to first slot. Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, we'd be happy to take that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's we now have the slot then from 1:20 to 2 o'clock for Matthijs Maas, who will speak about bridging the gap, the case for an incompletely theorized agreement on AI policy. Matthijs is currently a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, where he works on adaptive global governance approaches for extreme technological risks. In April, he defended his PhD thesis on AI governance at the University of Copenhagen. So, Matthijs, most welcome, and please go ahead.
Okay.
I see your slide is already up.
All right, so that works. So thank you very much, Olle. And there's nothing for one's nerves at a panel to suddenly having your talk moved up a little bit, but I'm very excited to get to talk to you about these sort of topics that are close to my heart. I find it extremely interesting, and I find it a very interesting sort of area of debate, both sort of like what in terms of what will happen in the coming years and the decisions what we may have to make in the coming years, and the roles that we can all sort of amongst ourselves play in these debates. And so I will be presenting today on a paper, an argument by myself and Charlotte Stix that we published just a few years ago. Sorry, just a few. It feels like years in the pandemic. A few months ago this spring, and the argument here was focused on the AI ethics community, chronicling some of sort of the developments that have been sort of going on within that community, and making an argument over what we would feel would be productive avenues for development in order to make sure that this community is well equipped and well organized and coherent in order to both focus on a broad sort of portfolio of AI ethics challenges, and as well to be in a good position to shape policy both at a national level and in terms of a subnational level, but also at an international level. And so in short, our argument is basically about why we should bridge the gap in AI policy. And we propose one way how, a principle that we could use to ground this gap, to ground this bridging in practical policy contexts. And the question here is, of course, what gap are we talking about here? So it probably, if you're in this talk now, it shouldn't be a surprise that there's been a lot going on in AI, and there has been a lot sort of going on in potential challenges around AI ethics. So the last few years, we've seen the deployment of these systems and the sort of steady development of new types of systems create an ecosystem of AI uses that is definitely not without sort of its current limits and shortfalls and preconditions. And there's definitely sort of both sort of hype as well as underappreciation in these debates. But as a technology that is aimed at automating sort of facets or sort of subsets of human task performance in a range of contexts, it is no surprise that AI has in principle the ability to affect any domain of human sort of task activity. And so that has given rise to a wide range of existing sort of AI challenges, emerging and prospective AI challenges, and sort of anticipated challenges, if and how these risks and problems may develop into the longer term. And so in the face of this, it's quite plausible that we will need a well-coordinated expert community, a so-called epistemic community, to take the lead on societal debates. That is both in reaction or in relation to sort of general societal debates, as well as in shaping specific policy responses. So we need a AI community that can, for instance, shift researcher norms about how to think about the downstream impacts of their research, or the costs, the environmental or social costs of their research on different communities. This community needs to be able to scrutinize AI principles, so tech developers, governments, or users. And it needs to be able to engage both the public as well as affected stakeholders in these debates and in policy formation. And it needs to be able to advocate and lobby governments to understand the need for specific policies, minimum standards, or regulations that provide accountability. And so we can sort of keep going on a number of sort of specific deliverables and policy programs that we'll need. And so given this need for a sort of active epistemic community, it's interesting and maybe slightly concerning that in some recent years, we've seen an apparent separation in parts of this community between scholars and researchers that focus more on AI sort of evident problems that are appearing today and in the near term, and other scholars that are looking at sort of more uncertain challenges, either sort of extrapolated from today's challenges or deriving from historical comparisons or deriving from philosophical arguments that look at more uncertain challenges into the long term. And so while this is overgeneralizing a bit, you can see the types of issues that different sort of scholars work on as sort of focusing on these clusters. So some of the focus of the near term scholar community is on issues like algorithmic bias, facial recognition, self-driving cars and deepfakes. and we can sort of keep going on. And some of the focus of scholars in the long-term community is on topics like, well, foraging sort of extreme technological unemployment, even as that sort of develops. Transformative societal impacts, including sort of risks to epistemic security if computational propaganda gets really refined. Risks to strategic stability and things like nuclear deterrent stability as more AI systems get implemented in things like nuclear command and control or military decision makings, or also extreme risks from potential more advanced AI systems. And it's whether we're talking specifically about something like artificial general intelligence or other types of systems that sort of fall short of or are separate of the like a human-like benchmark, but types of systems that could cause quite extreme or catastrophic risks if they are deployed in unsafe ways, or if they are not aligned with the underlying set of human values. And now, to be fair and to be sort of clear, there has been recent work in the last few years that has begun to question and nuance the meaningfulness of this as a distinction to sort of cut the field or understand the dynamics in the field, as well as sort of calls for greater sort of reconciliation or collaboration between these communities, given that at times some scholars in these communities have been dismissive of one another in sort of social media debates, which is never a good place to conduct the most refined academic exchange, perhaps. And so this is where our argument here comes in, is that we want to clarify that the aim of this paper and this argument is not to try and take a position or on many of these underlying debates over AI, its future trajectories, its risks, or sort of the ethics of deciding what takes urgency. It's rather to reflect on these sort of social dynamics and self-facing narratives that the AI ethics epistemic community tells about itself, and how it relates to itself, in order to map, if possible, the practical space for collaboration. And so in doing so, we argue that from an outside view, this matters because how this community is organized and how coherent it is and how it sort of talks within itself matters to the degree of how it is going to be able to pursue policy impact in the coming years. We also argue that there's a great degree of nuance to these debates than a quick look at sort of newspaper headlines might sort of suggest. So for one, isolated sort of spats do not represent sort of widespread sort of respectful engagement. We think that, and this draws on an argument by Karina Prunkel and Jess Whittlestone, that having a narrative of sort of near-term and long-term research communities on AI that are sort of very distinct and are distinct tribes, this whole narrative sort of overstates the more complex heterogeneity and the actual views people who hold on a lot of these underlying positions around the AI. And even where sort of there are disagreements, we argue that those do not need to be barriers to practical collaboration on AI policy. And so finally, given this, we propose a principle that can grant and justify more productive collaboration on AI policy amongst scholars in these communities where there do exist sort of shared policy interests. So that is the overlying, or the overarching sort of trust or direction of this argument. But to sort of dive into that, this argument takes 3 steps. So first, why does it even matter, the organization of the AI ethics community? Secondly, what are some of the arguments that sort of could justify this separation, and how much do they hold up, and how much do they actually create barriers to actual cooperation? And finally, if these barriers are either not there or they're not so relevant to collaboration in specific spaces, are there actually policy spaces or research spaces where collaboration is sort of in a shared interest? And if so, what kinds of principles could we draw on to justify this type of pragmatic collaboration? And so to start off, as noted, many of AI's challenges need urgent and responsive policies, and not just to sort of address risks, of course, also to sort of realize and secure a lot of the sort of pro-social benefits and avert things like market failures and things like that. And so we can ask, is the current responsible AI policy community in a good position to deliver or advocate these types of policies? And so in a sense, it's maybe too early to sort of tell, because this community is still quite young. It's still sort of developing. We've seen, looking back, even sort of just 3 years, topics like the algorithmic justice or algorithmic accountability community have gone through quite notable developments in just a few years. And also in this time, there have been some policy successes in some areas, including making certain companies more aware of the impacts of and bias in their data sets and algorithms, and leading to retractions. In a range of moratoria by a range of US companies and selling facial recognition systems to policing departments, as well as a number of other spaces. But we've also seen a number of policy gridlocks, including in areas of lethal autonomous weapon systems, digital unitarianism, and also, of course, some of the current debates over how private sector companies like Google are treating their internal critics that I'm sure also Mohammed will be telling you a lot more about shortly. And so the underlying picture here seems to be somewhat mixed still. And it's important to recognize that sustained policy shifts and changing sort of the framework for policymakers may take time and may take coherent epistemic community action on topics like framing the issues, consolidating the policy options, and having sort of networks and implement these or drive implementation at both a national level and internationally. And so in this context, if there was going to be sustained fragmentation or sort of at an extent of infighting or bickering in this community, this can undercut policy access, credibility, or efficacy at a key moment in time when we want our community to really get a lot of momentum on AI policy. And so we can also look at a range of historical contexts to sort of suggest that the structure of a field or community has an outsized impact on its ability to shape and influence tech policy downstream. And so one example here is the nanotech community, where the sort of infamous high-profile 2003 Drexler-Smalley debate led to a public falling out between parts of the community. It cemented this caricature of a field as being very extremely split between people focused on sort of very near-term topics like sort of material science and nanotech within sort of creating different materials and implications of that, and sort of the health implications of those materials, versus people focusing on the long-term impacts of more futuristic nanotechnology. But a range of scholars sort of chronicling the development of these debates argue that this debate and this falling out was largely fueled by a sort of parascientific media that was aiming to sort of fan the flames of this debate and this controversy in order to attract audiences and influence scientific funding. And so it created the appearance of irreconcilable dichotomies that out of what was in fact a more ambiguous set of uncertainties amongst scholars and researchers in the field. A contrasting sort of more optimistic case going a bit further back is during the Cold War, sort of the early 1950s, 1960s epistemic community on ballistic missile defense in the US that included scholars from both a technical background as well as sort of strategy researchers that coordinated to highlight the risks of having defensive ballistic missile systems and how destabilizing this would be on nuclear deterrence, basically giving either party a first strike incentive. And they were able to converge on a shared understanding of this and disseminate this not just to the sort of US leadership in the White House, but also through scientific conferences to the Soviet leadership. And in doing so, they laid the foundations of the anti-ballistic missile treaty that was the first of its sort of kind in terms of arms control. And so extrapolating that, as an AI community, there may be a closing window of opportunity to act in terms of the ability to shape problem framings, the government instrument choice and design, or at an international level, which fora we try to lobby or work through. But all of these issues are likely to become more rigid and intractable to change in the coming years as framings, public perceptions, and sort of stakeholder interests and investments in AI sort of crystallize and get out there. And so there's also a risk that policymakers are, in some countries and areas, are getting drawn into sort of narratives of this is about global competition, it's about an arms race. And so if we mishandle the way we approach AI policymaking today, or if there is an appearance of sort of infighting or bickering, or these are just merely different interest groups rather than a coherent AI epistemic community, this could sort of poison the well and yield a decline in our ability to participate in or shape policy debates going forward. So why that sort of suggests that it would be important to think about how this community is organized. But so what are the underlying possible grounds for disagreement here? And are they actually so fundamental as is perceived? And so thinking about this, there's different ways of thinking about this. One, of course, is at the appearance of sort of the object level of, so how is this presented? Is people saying, well, we should either, like, do we worry about today's algorithms, or do you worry about the far future? But Charlotte and I have argued in this paper that there are a range of underlying sort of judgments here. And so one could be around different sort of scientific, epistemic, or methodological commitments, either over when do we feel that scientific uncertainty is sort of low enough that we can take certain possibilities as serious as grounds for policy action or precautionary action, and how great should the costs then be? And of course, we've seen similar debates in the last few years on questions like pandemic policy and early action on that. There could be other judgments on different types of evidence in these debates. So to what extent can we extrapolate from the observed failure modes in existing machine learning systems and say that those are going to get worse, or those are going to get heavier, or bias in certain systems is only going to get more pervasive, or is a more underlying problem in how AI companies sort of run a lot of systems to optimize certain metrics, and it's just a fundamental problem that's only going to get worse as you get more advanced AI systems. And so there may be different judgments at an epistemic level over whether to admit these types of evidence or how to weight them. And it's important, we argue that while these are all very important from a scientific perspective, and while there are legitimate different philosophical stances you can take on this, they don't pragmatically foreclose collaboration issue areas where AI scholars converge and share policy goal. Another type of disagreement could be more around what people perceive over how high impact is AI going to be and when is it going to come. But we argue along with Prunk and Whittlestone that we can actually, rather than having a sort of a near-term versus long-term distinction, there are instead a wide range of distinct judgments in people over how sophisticated AI capabilities could get, or when they might get so, how large the societal impacts of that would be. So even if there is something like human level AI, would that just be sort of like having robot butlers, which seems not as high as something of the other scenarios that would involve more far-reaching economic or societal disruption or even extreme risks. Another different perception is about, what are the certainty of these different scenarios? And indeed, sort of how extreme would the stakes be involved? And so rather than this being two different tribes of scholars that have that sort of all converge on similar sets of judgments on all these four types of questions, we argue that in practice, people's positions on all these four grounds can be both more heterogeneous and varied than a sort of than a simple sort of one-off model would suggest. Another potential ground could be just different assumptions that people have over what are the path dependencies of governing AI. So scholars, there are a number of scholars, and I think Rodney Brooks, for instance, has argued that, there's some that think, no, sorry, there are some arguments that amongst people in a long-term set that think that, well, even if we govern effectively for near-term issues, the consequences of having effective governance might not sort of scale up. But that seems, on examination, not plausible, given that many near-term issues and the way we govern them are likely to sort of scale up, affect our conditions for doing governance in the long term. So the sort of international stability, the prominence of sort of fake news, as well as the goodwill amongst different actors and the goodwill amongst the public. And conversely, some scholars, such as Rodney Brooks, have argued that, well, there's no way that we can really govern for these long-term problems. We'll have to take that in the future as it comes along, because we don't even know what it looks like. So how could we make policy? But again, legal scholarship generally suggests, in a lot of these case studies, suggest that there are very important path dependencies in an early stage that can shape how the technology ends up getting governed. And that can be both in terms of the community norms, in terms of specific laws and regulatory frameworks, as well as just the anecdotes or the analogies that policymakers use to understand the technology. So is data more like fuel, or is it more like sunlight as it's a public good, or is it more like labor? And those all have important downstream consequences to how further types of problems get governed. And so we might not know what the specific types of AI look like, but it is definitely possible to set the general framework or the tools or the general norms for shaping AI challenges into the longer term. And then there's very tactically or pragmatically, some have suggested that, well, there's perceptions of inter-community competition over resources, but that may not hold up in the sense of Victoria Krakovna and DeepMind has sort of argued that, well, in terms of media attention, long-term researchers sort of by a large majority are equally aversive to media coverage that sort of has Terminator pictures, and would much prefer that this is toned down very much, and that some people like Elon Musk get no more or get much less attention to this. In terms of funding, there's not necessarily much current overlap in sort of area-specific funding streams. What overlap there is tends to be on types of projects or questions that have relevance to both near sort of existing regulation or existing AI like ethics problems, as well as long-term AI ethics problems. And meanwhile, yeah, likewise in sort of talent streams, there doesn't seem to be a meaningful brain drain of AI researchers from one camp to the other, and instead there seems to be more of a overlap. And so in some, many sort of potentially perceived barriers or trade-offs between those communities are arguably overstated, contestable, or unnecessary, or even if they were to exist, they wouldn't be quite relevant to precluding policy collaboration on specific AI policy programs. And then sort of coming to the final question then, of course, even if we've sort of made the case that the organization of community matters, and if we've made the case that many of these types of barriers are sort of phantom barriers, are not so strong, or just are not so relevant to cooperation, is there actually space for mutually productive opportunities to work on? And if so, how could we justify this? And so we argue in our paper that we could draw on the legal principle of a incompletely theorized agreement, which comes from constitutional law. And the argument there is that an incompletely theorized agreement allows a community to bypass or suspend underlying deep theoretical disagreements on either in terms of sort of values or in terms of judgments of sort of, problems in the world, in situations where the underlying disagreement appears relatively intractable, either given sort of the current information that we have available, the types of scientific information that we can access, or just sort of underlying deep value commitments. And there is still an urgent need to address shared practical issues. And so Castensen argues that incompletely theorized agreements are a way to allow people to live together in many contexts, and they show a form of mutual respect. and basically allow us to find a way forward while acknowledging uncertainty on a range of both ethical but also scientific questions. And what's key is that these types of agreements have been argued to have underpinned a wide range of landmark global agreements, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where during a 1948 meeting, they asked these sort of state representatives, sort of like, well, you include countries from such diverse backgrounds and sort of communist and capitalist and others, and how could you come together and agree on this list of rights? Where the committee's response is essentially, yeah, we agree on these rights, but on condition that no one asks us why. And so, but then the question is, of course, where would that be relevant? And we argue that sort of giving a very sort of preliminary list and not trying to be exhaustive or definitive, there are areas of strategy relevant research for both quote unquote near-term and long-term AI ethics communities, both into the general levers of government policy formation. So how do governments make policies? What are the barriers there? And what are the steps in terms of interest group implementation and such? What is the relative efficacy of various policy levers at actually achieving sort of output or change in AI governance? So do codes of ethics actually work at shaping programmer decisions on the ground? Does naming and shaming work at changing different private actors' sort of behavior? Or are the gaps sort of filled by other sort of less scrupulous tech actors? And how effective is hard law, or can it not keep pace to the changing state of the technology? There's also a shared area of interest in better ways to scrutinize and mitigate undue influence or regulatory capture by various stakeholders, such as sort of private actors, on AI ethics research programs. Or there's more generally the question of sort of what Yates and Gabriel and Gazavi have called social value alignment. So the question of how to align AI systems with the plurality of cultural values endorsed by a wide range of people, which could be one area where there's a continuity between the work of today's fairness, accountability, and transparency AI ethics, as well as sort of long-term AI alignment or AI safety research. And more practically, there's a wide range of areas where there could be joint policy action supported by an incompletely theorized agreement, whether on debates over the appropriate scientific culture or norms around sharing AI research or considering the ex-ante impacts of your research, or debates on potential regulation or bans of military uses of AI. Policy interventions are aimed at preserving sort of the integrity of public discourse against computational propaganda and deep fakes, or policies to secure the autonomy of citizens and their independence from manipulation, which has both existing literatures and research communities in both the so-called near-term community as well as the long-term AI community, which are concerned about this very same policy area for slightly distinct but overlapping reasons. And finally, there could be a shared area of interest, which is about making sure that whatever regulations we have, they remain adaptive to changes in the uses or the state of the art in AI technology from both the near and the long term. So in sum, we don't propose that incompletely theorized agreements are an unambiguously valuable tool across like all AI policy cases, or even the best single tool in any specific case. And there are a number of sort of drawbacks that we can also start discussing. And these sort of considerations should be considered before starting to draw on them in any specific policy area for collaboration. But we do suggest that it would be useful for the AI ethics communities to step away from this narrative of there's a gap between long-term and near-term scholars, or long-term and near-term work, and to think a bit about how real these barriers are and how relevant these barriers are to collaboration, because there is a need for exploring these opportunities for shared research or policy action under the umbrella of this incompletely theorized agreement to shape AI policy in the coming years. And I'm very excited to explore that both now in this discussion today and in the coming years together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthijs, for this interesting presentation. do we have any questions or comments? And I think actually we are sufficiently few people in the room now that it will work if you just grab the microphone and ask a question out loud. Otherwise, if you prefer, you can ask in the chat. Let me start then with a question of my own. Here's a question from Björn Bengtsson. Would you like to grab the microphone, Björn, and ask it out loud?
Well, I can just restate what I wrote in the chat. Matthijs, you mentioned briefly at the end that there are drawbacks with ITAs. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks. So that's a good point, and also something that should be sort of flagged. So, and I actually have backup slides, which is a nice way of. So a few of the limitations include something like an incompletely theorized agreement is an agreement to sort of suspend, or not suspend, but to sort of understand that there's underlying disagreement over some of the sort of like underlying questions over, well, where would AI go in the next sort of 10, 20, 30, 40 years? How far could it ever go? So we understand that there's underlying disagreement. We still are happy to collaborate. But that may lead to situations where the practical agreement is dependent on certain, well, where a change in the circumstances might actually lead one of the two communities to no longer support this policy goal. And by bracketing these types of debates and saying, let's just work together because we agree on this specific project, it may be hard to see, to sort of anticipate the situations where these communities would no longer have a shared interest. And there may be policy areas where that would not be the case. And I think areas like the perception control would be sort of broadly similar, and things like explainability research and reliability research. But yeah, I'm thinking, so there could be cases where, let's see, where, okay, just hypothetically, if there was a type of sort of AI architecture that seemed particularly useful for investigating bias in AI systems, and that seemed useful for also ensuring sort of the corrigibility of future AI systems as they get more advanced, both communities would support that line of research and support policy action to implement that. But if at some point the advancing state of research would convince the more long-term oriented community that, in fact, this is really these type of architecture or ways of developing a system are very hazardous from a perspective of correcting and reducing larger risks, they would no longer support these policies. And it's sort of important to understand for both communities when their shifts come up. More generally, it's important for communities to understand that this is sort of a stopgap measure to move ahead on policies that we need in the next few years, or public debates that we need in the next few years, so long as we don't really have sort of knock it out of the park evidence in some of these claims. So there's no unambiguous evidence over that either sort of like a very, very powerful AI is 5 years away, or it's completely impossible forever. And so, but we still need to remember that it's a stopgap measure for this period, rather than just like this is a general ideal or a permanent fix that should always keep being the way how we operate. And we also should not stop, we should of course not stop having these parallel scientific debates over where we expect AI to develop and why we should care and these things. And another thing is that a sloppily formulated, incompletely theorized agreement could actually inhibit effective action. For instance, if we have a surface level agreement on vague general principles, so we agree that we want responsible policy in AI, and of course that is a good thing to agree on, but if we haven't actually amongst these communities cashed out what we mean by that and what are the asks that we want from a government, this may actually prevent the articulation of more effective policies, because we both agree on this sort of, we lobby governments on making AI responsible, but we haven't sort of drilled down to the specific policies that we agree on in terms of a certification scheme, or a scheme for allowing whistleblowers to leak unethical practices at companies and get legal protection. And so those are some of the potential drawbacks of using an incompletely theorized agreement. If that helps. There's also some benefits that I would just put on there.
So Björn, are you satisfied with the answer, or do you have a follow-up question?
Yes. I thought along those lines myself as I heard you talk, Matthijs. And there were a couple of points where I reacted a bit when you talked about things that should be able to, areas where you think that we should be able to reach agreement. And one point in particular was regulatory capture. To me, that stood out a bit. Do you have any more thoughts on that particular? That seemed to me like a potentially ideologically fraught point. I don't know if you agree.
Well, so it's a good point. Thank you. Thanks for raising that, actually. So I think there's, I think that there are, discussing these types of like finding areas where we, where there's a shared interest in communities to work on this, or having where basically where there's no or less disagreement potentially on sort of on a near-term, long-term AI access, doesn't mean that there's still sort of potential disagreement amongst sort of AI ethics scholars in general over what is the best sort of theory of change at governing any AI, and what are the risks of sort of like working within private companies, working from the outside, working through sort of naming and shaming mechanisms and civil society, working through government regulation and NSO. So there are, of course, a wide range of underlying disagreements that would still be over, what would be the best way for a community to conduct research, and what are the risks of different strategies, and what does it need to be aware of. I think, I guess a practical answer would be something that very practically, we're all researchers, we have academic freedom. No one should engage in pursuing a project, either a research project that they think, sort of constraints is either not promising or is potentially dangerous, or constraints for academic freedom. And also people shouldn't lobby for AI ethics policies that they think are bad, either in terms of sort of prima facie ideological grounds, or bad in terms of what that could do. Either bad in terms of if you think we as researchers just shouldn't participate in that, that's a separate debate, or bad in terms of we just expect bad outcomes, or bad in the sense of it could do good outcomes, but if it fails, there's going to be a big backlash, or there's a big sort of drawback. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for this, Matthijs. I think to stay on schedule, we need to wrap up here. There will be plenty of time for further discussion at the
thank you very much.
Final panel discussion. So let us all thank Matthijs once more in whatever ways we do nowadays over Zoom. And our next speaker is Markus Anderljung, who I think he mixed up Swedish and UK time or something, but now he's here with us and ready to give his talk. Markus will speak about institutionalizing ethics in AI through broader impact requirements. Markus has a background in history and the philosophy of science, and as an executive director of Effective Altruism Sweden. Currently, he serves as project manager of operations and policy engagement at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. Markus, please, the floor is yours. Do you have slides to share?
I do, yeah. Yeah, while I get those up, yeah, I should apologize. I am Swedish, and so I have experienced this thing of sort of time differences between Sweden and the UK for like the past, I think maybe 10 years or something like this. But I still seem to be unable to wrap my head around this. So yeah, sorry to Matthijs for you having to hop in and sort of cover for me. I think that should be sharing. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so I will be talking about some work that I've been involved with some of the colleagues at the Future of Humanity Institute about this, around this introduction of what are called broader impact statements or broader impact statement requirements. And so, yeah, I guess to give a little bit of context, this is basically what I will do is I'll sort of tell you the story of the introduction of this requirement by one of the sort of most prestigious conferences in the AI space, NeurIPS. And this is a requirement where researchers have to write out what they think will be the societal impacts, both positive and negative, of their research within the paper that they submit to this conference. And then also as a bit of context, to explain why this might matter is that sort of in the AI space, for the most part, conferences of this kind are sort of the main venue through which people publish. Publishing via sort of peer-reviewed journals is something that's done far less. And so yeah, so we've done a decent chunk of work to do with the story of this sort of requirement, and sort of I guess. Another bit of context that's helpful is, or something that might sort of confuse you if you are aware of the Future of Humanity Institute and the kind of work that we tend to do, is that, well, our work tends to, if we want to use this sort of near-term, long-term dichotomy that Matthijs was talking about, though I agree that it's not particularly helpful, FHI's research tends to be focusing on sort of more long-term or sort of more scenarios of sort of more advanced AI systems. And so you might wonder, why are we focusing on this? And from my perspective, the main reason is that because of these reasons of sort of the advanced systems that we'll have in the future, they'll grow out of our current systems, and sort of the context in which those more advanced systems will be built. So that context will be shaped by sort of our current context, our current norms, our current sort of institutional baggage that we have in place. And so we saw this as a particularly useful case study to look at, to learn more about how can we help the AI community build up the set of norms, the kinds of institutional mechanisms that they'll need, and that we'll need as a society to be able to deal with sort of more advanced systems that might exist in the future. So yeah, I'll give you a brief history of sort of what happened with this requirement. I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the research that we went ahead and did, and then I'll sort of speculate a little bit about some questions that seem particularly interesting or important to me when we sort of look ahead from what we can learn from this requirement. So I guess the sort of general context that's helpful to figure out is that sort of the AI community over the past few years, I guess primarily since maybe 2015 or so, has been sort of increasingly grappling with the impacts of its research, both due to sort of external factors of sort of actors maybe such as sort of the folks in this room, or the folks that will be talking to you today, but also from the general public, etc., of people being increasingly worried about potential negative impacts from AI research. And so AI research is more and more coming up to sort of coming into contact with the real world, and as such having impacts on the real world, or having potential impacts on the real world, such that people will have a stake in figuring out how what those impacts will be, and what we do to make sure that they are as positive as possible. There's also a number of sort of internal factors within the AI community where there's been this sort of growing field of AI ethics that sort of, to a large extent, draws upon talent within the AI research community, which means that sort of yeah, there is this context of at least large swaths of the AI community wanting to push in favor of sort of harsher requirements or sort of broader efforts to do something about the impacts of AI research, whereas other bits of the community might sort of be more resistant to that and might want to sort of pursue more of a sort of pure science perspective on the research. And so to start this story, I think one good place to start is in 2018, when Brent Hecht and some others, they published this piece called "It's Time to Do Something, Mitigating the Negative Impacts of Computing Through a Change to the Peer Review Process," through ACM, which got a decent amount of traction, which basically argues in favor of something like a broader impact statement. So they say that sort of inspired by practices in other fields, such as what's done in, for example, in gain-of-function research, in synthetic biology, and sort of just ethics review processes that are done in fields that have sort of direct impacts on the world. They suggested this requirement where people will need to, in the paper that they write, that they submit somewhere, they have to say, what are the impacts of your research on the sort of on society. So it's not just sort of the direct impacts that sort of an IRB will often be focusing on, and also it focuses on both the positive and the negative impacts that would be considered. Whereas sort of quite often when sort of a funding body asks you to think about the sort of broader impacts of your research, the sort of implicit question that they're actually asking is more something like, what is the sort of best case in favor of pursuing this research? What are sort of the benefits that society might see? And so actually, I think this is a really interesting innovation, this requirement, because it combines these features. It asks researchers, like researchers as opposed to other parts of the sort of research ecosystem, to evaluate sort of the impacts of their research. Yeah, it focuses on these sort of broader impacts, not just sort of the direct impacts of the research. And it focuses both on the sort of positive and the negative side of things. And this sort of mechanism sort of will have had some sort of internal discussions within the AI community over a period of time, which then led to February 2020, when NeurIPS, they introduced this requirement. It was roughly in line with the recommendation in this Hecht et al. Piece, but it was sort of it had no bearing on the acceptance of the paper to the conference, which was something that sort of Hecht et al. Initially seemed to be in favor of, and also sort of to sort of reduce the potential costs of sort of doing this, following this requirement. You didn't have to include the text in your page limit, which tends to be very, very short. And then sort of alongside of this, they also introduced an ethics board with the ability to actually reject papers solely on ethical grounds. And then we come to sort of how sort of the AI community reacts. I haven't seen any systematic analysis of this, so these are sort of my impressions, which are something like the AI ethics researchers and sort of advocates in general of sort of AI ethics issues were sort of broadly positive, thought this was sort of a useful direction to go in, maybe a useful experiment to sort of try out and see how it would go. Whereas many sort of AI researchers, in particular very sort of prominent ones like John LeCun and these kinds of folks, would express a decent amount of reservations about it. Some of the main sort of arguments that I thought we saw were that sort of the statements would end up putting responsibility on researchers for the impact of their research, whereas that is something that sort of these folks thought was a really bad idea. That like actually the sort of the entity that should be deciding what research is too dangerous or sort of what we should be doing about potential impacts of research is society rather than the researchers. Also, just thinking that it's a very, very difficult task, and that sort of this is something that researchers will struggle with a bunch, and even if they sort of end up writing something, most likely that will be not particularly helpful, because these are just such difficult questions to tackle. And sort of in line with that, a lot of people seem to express some kind of sentiment of thinking that these statements would sort of put an unnecessary burden on researchers, and that burden wouldn't be worth it. Then we sort of move forward in history, but so between sort of May and December of 2020, we have submissions that sort of go ahead in May, June, and sort of the conference goes ahead in 2020. During this time, there's sort of some different discussions. So for example, there's a workshop called the Navigating Broader Impacts of AI Research on that sort of a workshop that goes ahead alongside the NeurIPS, or sort of it's an official NeurIPS workshop that sort of features a decent amount of discussion about these topics. Sort of alongside this, we also have some diffusion of this requirement going on. And so in particular, two of the sort of the sort of biggest conferences on natural language processing, EMNLP and NAALC, they adopt a similar requirement where they ask researchers to write a ethics statement or a statement about sort of ethical impacts of their research. We move forward a little bit, we come to sort of the sort of twist in this story, which is in March 2021, when we have a new committee for the NeurIPS conference. They come in and they sort of look at some of the response from the community, and they decide to remove the response, remove this requirement, and they replace it with something new. They replace it with what they called a NeurIPS paper checklist. And this checklist, it'll ask people things like, you know, did you report report your actual methodology? Is it possible for others to reproduce your research? Did you have sort of direct impacts on folks, like sort of typical IRB type questions? So institutional review board type questions. So things like, were there human participants in your research? Were those people treated well? Like, were they, for example, compensated for their work? Are you using data that might have come from people who didn't provide their consent? Those kinds of questions. And they also prompt researchers to do things like thinking through the positive and negative impacts of their research. Also prompt them in favor of including sort of a limitation section where they might talk about in what ways their research might not work out or might not fulfill the promise that you might think. And why did they do this? It's difficult to know, at least like from the public record, we don't have that much information. I put down a particular quote here from the sort of blog post where they announced it, and from sort of this quote, and from reading between the lines in the blog post, it seems to me like the main issue was just that sort of the feedback from the folks who sort of managed to submit papers to the conference. It was just quite negative about this requirement, and the people might have thought it onerous, they might have thought it sort of useless, and these kinds of things. Although I would be very, very excited to see actual data on this and sort of things made public on this question, so that we could learn more from the requirement. Another important feature of this sort of paper checklist is that you can choose to make it public. So that your paper will be sort of published alongside a little table where you'll have little check marks of whether you fulfilled the different checklist questions or no. So that's a brief sort of history of what's happened. How did sort of me and sort of others of my colleagues engage with this? We sort of started engaging with this question in the spring of 2020, roughly around when sort of this requirement was made public. And so what we did at that point is we sort of collected a little team of folks, some folks based at FHI, and then also a few folks, particularly with expertise in sort of the machine learning space, so sort of researchers who would have published at NeurIPS multiple times. And then also other folks, for example, with experience from the responsible research and innovation field. So for example, Helena Webb down there at the bottom. So we did two things and are potentially doing a third thing. So the first thing we did was we wrote up sort of a guide to researchers on how they might write a research statement or write an impact statement. So we did this basically just be sort of in response to it seeming like a lot of researchers were quite confused as to how to respond to this requirement, and sort of the guidance that we found out there didn't look like it was particularly useful. And furthermore, we also thought that we would be able to sort of push researchers into sort of focusing on the bits or sort of the parts of that you might put in such a ethics statement that we would find particularly helpful as what you might think of as sort of consumers of this research, as folks who sort of work on AI governance and AI ethics questions. We also wrote this piece here on the right, institutionalizing ethics in AI through broader impact requirements, where we try to reason about how useful are these broader impact statements as a tool to start institutionalizing some of the AI ethics principles that are sort of coming out or have sort of been coming out of the research AI research community over the past few years. So I'll sort of start by talking a little bit about sort of what was in that paper. We tried to sort of, one of the main things we did was we tried to sort of provide a way of thinking about what the potential benefits and the potential sort of costs of introducing a requirement like this might be. And the thought was that in doing so, we'd be able to sort of help the AI research community better deliberate about how they would, like what kinds of institutional mechanisms they ought to put in place to be able to sort of build up to the kinds of ways of dealing with AI ethics issues that they would like. So the first benefit that we talk about is a benefit of sort of enabling anticipation and action. And so the thought here is that if we want to figure out what if you want to sort of improve the impacts of AI on the world, a very sort of simple model of how to think about that is that sort of one, we need to know what the impacts will be. So we need to sort of anticipate those impacts. And then second, we need to sort of take action to either sort of seize some of the sort of potential benefits or sort of avoid some of the potential risks. And in AI, much like sort of in other fields that are sort of highly technical, we have this issue where quite often the people who are at the forefront of the technology, those are the people who you might think would be sort of the best positioned to actually know what the potential impacts might be. Or at the very least, a statement that seems to me more true and that I'm like more confident in is that these folks will be best able to actually figure out what are the kinds of capabilities that we will have in the future. And once we sort of know what those capabilities are, if we sort of marry that understanding with folks who might understand sort of sociological dynamics or might understand sort of how such capabilities might affect our political system or economic system or whatnot, then we can use that to sort of try to understand what will the impacts of AI be on society, and start thinking about what sort of action might be. And so sort of the main benefit here, in my mind, is that we sort of involve researchers early on in the process of trying to figure out what the potential impacts of AI might be, which might sort of enable earlier action than we would have otherwise. Another sort of benefit is more about helping the AI researcher community itself better sort of understand and better sort of grapple with these kinds of questions. And so I think in my mind, one of the sort of biggest, might actually be one of the biggest sort of potential benefits from this requirement is that you force researchers to actually sit down for whatever it might be, maybe half an hour, to actually try to answer the question, what is the actual impact of my research? Should that process go well, you could imagine that these researchers might sort of change their research direction in sort of directions that they believe might be more beneficial to society, or they might even sort of start advocating more for sort of positive change or for ways of sort of making sure that AI research is sort of used as much as possible to the betterment of society. So the last benefit that I also think is quite important is we sort of termed it coordination. I don't really know what the best term is here, but the thing that you're doing is you're creating common knowledge of what other people's or what other people's beliefs are about AI impacts. And so the thought is that if we could just get data on what kinds of risks AI researchers think might be some of the biggest risks in AI, for example, that might be a tool that could be very useful for maybe for example for folks like myself. So these are the kinds of things that would be very easy or very useful to be able to communicate to policymakers. It might also be a thing that would be very useful for folks like myself or sort of AI ethics or governance researchers to figure out what are sort of disagreements where more research would be helpful, or where more discussion among AI researchers would be particularly helpful. And then I guess it's sort of sort of another benefit might be for the AI researcher community itself, where if you create common knowledge that sort of, oh, we're all worried about this particular thing, which we didn't know that everyone else was worried about the same thing, that might sort of help this community better coordinate as sort of a political actor, which might sort of exert positive influence on the world and the trajectory of AI's impact on the world. But there's much like anything, there are also a lot of potential costs to introducing this requirement, and we listed some of them as follows. One that just seems very plausible to me is just that the statements might have pretty bad quality deficits, or it seems unlikely that we should expect AI researchers who maybe haven't spent a lot of time thinking about these kinds of issues, that they will be able to provide a statement that will be informative to the world as a whole, or even be informative to themselves or to other researchers. And you might worry that this would sort of waste time of the researchers that could be spent in some better way. Or you could also imagine that like it also has this sort of negative effect. If people actually trust what's in these statements, then sort of that might cause some problems, because it might sort of perpetuate misunderstandings and whatnot. Another worry that I take very, very seriously, this is probably the one that I was the most worried about when we saw this all being introduced, is that researchers might become sort of more negatively inclined towards AI ethics interventions in the future, and they might just sort of have a more negative attitude towards any action that someone might take in favor of trying to sort of identify potentially negative impacts of AI and trying to sort of restrain those impacts in some way, that they might be sort of more negatively inclined towards that, might think more that that's something that might sort of infringe on their freedom as a researcher, and those kinds of things. I think another sort of important negative impact is sort of that it might sort of signal things that you don't want to be signaled by this kind of requirement. So for example, you might imagine there are some cases you can imagine where this kind of requirement might signal sort of a trivialization. It might signal that like, oh, it's actually not that hard to figure out what the impacts of AI research might be, because you just write sort of a short little paragraph, and there you have it. And so that's something that you might want to sort of do something about. Another thing that you might want to do something about is sort of avoiding this perception that we talked about sort of at the start, that researchers were worried about, where there'll be sort of a misplacement of responsibility, that researchers might sort of come to be seen as the sort of locus of responsibility for the impacts of AI research, which seems both false and seems like a sort of a bad belief to be propagated around the world. Because that might sort of hamper sort of useful action to lead to positive change. Another sort of worry that I think is also reasonable to have is something like worry about polarization. And so overall, people will often have this, or at least scientists will often have this sort of quite strong intuition that science should be pursued primarily with a focus on the scientific questions themselves, sort of without having too much encroachment from sort of political issues or from sort of controversial issues from the sort of outside social world. I think there are some things that are true about this, in particular that it might sort of lead to basically better research, and we might find out more things about the world. And you can imagine that sort of if one of these broader impact statements, if they played too big a role, you could imagine that this might be used as a tool, for example, by reviewers to sort of push a certain agenda that might not be the agenda that ought to be pushed in this particular context, for example. And so so in our sort of paper, we sort of go through these potential costs and these potential benefits, and then we sort of recommend a number of things that one might do to be able to sort of better secure the benefits and sort of avoid some of these costs. I won't go through those because there's the requirement was removed, but I would recommend that you have a look at that, and my sort of hope is that reasoning that we have there might be useful for future efforts that might look similar to this one. One particular recommendation that we did have was one that we had ourselves already acted upon, which was to give people a sort of better guide, some better understanding on how to actually write a broader impact statement. That if you're a researcher and you haven't thought much about these questions at all, I mean, in the sort of the best case scenario, you've had sort of maybe up to 8 lectures in sort of university about these kinds of questions. About what the impact of your research might be. And so it might be quite a daunting task, and you might need some guidance. And so what did we recommend that people do? We recommended that people go through sort of the following process. They try to ask basically these 3 questions. So first, they try to ask this question of sort of how could AI research, or how could sort of their research affect what ML applications, machine learning applications, would exist in the future. This is the question that seems the most important to me. This is the question where we should expect AI researchers to have the biggest sort of understanding and have the sort of the best comparative advantage compared to the rest of the world. And so really nailing this down and being very specific is something that we sort of try to encourage researchers to do. Once to do that, we suggested them to sort of think about, okay, well, say we have these applications in the world, what kind of societal implications will that have? What effects will that have on the world? What kind of dynamic effects might we see? Like sort of what kinds of responses might we see from the world, and what might be the effects of those responses? And then sort of thirdly, we try to ask people to think about what could be done to sort of improve the societal outcomes that might come out of this research, or sort of the strand of research that this particular paper is a part of. And sort of illustrating all this, we sort of introduced this idea of this sort of impact stack, where you might think of sort of, you might go from the sort of very foundational sort of type of research, where you might sort of just study theory, etc., to sort of ML techniques and up to ML applications, and then to sort of ML applications that are sort of applied to specific things out in the world, to those applications out in the outside world actually having societal impact in the world. And so using this as a tool to sort of try to think through what the impacts of your research might be. So that's what we did. And I'll close by sort of speculating a little bit about sort of what the future might hold, and sort of what we might learn from this this whole experience. So one question that seems really important is this question that I alluded to before, which is this question of sort of why was actually this requirement removed? This seems like a question that we sort of really want to understand. If we're sort of thinking about this as a case study in how does the AI researcher community and the AI ecosystem as a whole, how does it react to or grapple with these sort of pushes in favor of doing more to sort of anticipate and do something about potential impacts of their research? It's also one of the particular things that sort of interests me about sort of this as a case study is trying to understand, is sort of a frame that you might think of as the AI researcher community is sort of, it has been in a phase of sort of trying to figure out what are sort of the principles that we think might be useful to follow. And now we have all these statements of sort of various principles that folks say that they should follow. And then once that's been put in place, the sort of next question might be, well, how do we actually sort of implement these principles in practice? And that is sort of a process that we've started to see, and we're starting to see more and more. And in particular, a question that I'm particularly interested in that context is, okay, well, what kinds of institutional mechanisms, what kinds of norms do we want to have in place that should enable the researcher community to sort of meet these sort of lofty standards that might have been set by these principles that have been sort of accepted and sort of lauded by various actors. And so understanding that seems to be particularly important. And I'm also particularly interested in understanding that from the perspective of, okay, well, what could we actually do to sort of push these norms in positive directions? What are sort of new requirements or new sort of institutions that we might try to put in place? And what would trying to understand what would be the sort of response from the AI researcher community, such that we can choose to sort of not perhaps sort of go too far, such that there's sort of enough pushback that the requirement doesn't sort of happen at all. Another question that seems really important to me to think about is this question of sort of how should we sort of think of this introduction of this requirement as a failure? I think that's sort of a useful frame, I think, to think through sort of the dynamics here, or sort of whether this is the kind of thing that we should be pushing for happening more in the world. I guess I'm a little bit unsure. My guess is that overall it ended up being a good idea, at the very least, sort of ex ante, so sort of before sort of trying it out. It seems plausible to me that it was a good idea to give this a go. It does also seem true to me that sort of more careful thought and more careful planning could have led to sort of greater success of the requirement. And so in particular, I could imagine that sort of just a simple thing like having a few examples of what a acceptable broader impact statement might look like would have had a really, really big, would have had sort of a big effect on people's views, or sort of how they appreciate the thing. But I think there's sort of like two other reasons that we might be sort of feel positive about this. One is that sort of we can think of this this requirement as sort of in kind of a cheeky way as having sort of provided air cover for other initiatives in this space. So for example, we saw that at the same time that NERPs introduced this requirement, they also introduced an ethics review board. And so this is a board that they have in place that has the right to, last year they had the right to reject papers. I think this year what they do is they have a right to recommend the rejection of a paper to the board of NERPs. But I would expect that those sort of recommendations to be taken very, very seriously. And that might actually be an even more important norm to put in place, and more important mechanism to have in place. And I think it's quite likely that had that been the only thing that was put in place, that would have taken a lot more flack than it did in reality. Whereas this sort of broader impact statement requirement ended up taking the brunt of the pushback, I would expect, simply because sort of everyone was required to do something about this, whereas this sort of ethics review process was something more that was sort of in the background, and not a lot of people had to engage with this process at all. And then I guess another thing that seems sort of useful and good to me is that also this sort of this requirement has sort of also pushed into other fields. So yeah, I mentioned these two conferences in the natural language processing field as well. Another question that I'm very interested in and feel require a bunch more study is this question of sort of, well, what did sort of the authors actually think about these requirements, and in particular, sort of what was actually in these statements? What can we learn from these statements? And sort of one of the main sort of reasons that one might be really excited about this, or at least that I'm excited about this, is I think it's likely that this is sort of the biggest source of data, the most rich source of data that we have about what do actually AI researchers believe are the potential impacts of their research, and what do they think should be done about that. Where sort of have some folks at our team who are currently trying to do some work on this. So I've sort of scraped some of the data and are currently doing a bit of analysis, which I'm hoping that we'll be able to share with the world at some point. There's also been a little bit of research by others in the field. For example, this paper here by Mohammed and Rolt, where they conducted a survey with about 50 people who had submitted papers to NERPs to sort of see what their views were. I'd also be really excited for NERPs to publish their data on what people actually thought about the requirement, and sort of to get a better sense of sort of the reason for the requirement being removed. Although, yeah, I think maybe that's unlikely to happen. Another question that seems important to me is this question of sort of how could we improve this NERPs paper checklist? And one particular way in which we could do so is to try to make it public. So I think this would be a really quite a good idea, whereas now it's sort of an optional thing to sort of have it be appended to the end of your paper. I would be excited about it being the case that you could just see the paper, or you could just see the checklist at the end of the paper, because this would allow folks like myself and my colleagues to be actually able to study overall trends on these things. So we could do research on things like what kinds of fields are such that people actually claim to be engaging with the negative and the potential positive impacts of their research. That would be something I'd be very, very interested in knowing. And then we'd be able to sort of study those trends over time, and we'd be able to study, this might be sort of the best source that we might have about how AI researchers' attitudes might change. Another thing that we might have, another benefit of that is that it might make researchers feel more pressured to want to be able to say yes to these various questions. And so that might push them in favor of taking sort of positive actions that are suggested by the checklist. Another thing that I would be excited about would be to also, for these sort of data reasons, to make sure that broader impact statements might be easier for researchers to find, or for sort of folks who read a paper to find. And so, for example, you could imagine that NERPs might sort of encourage authors to include it, the sort of reasoning about the sort of impacts of the research in sort of the introduction or the motivation of the paper. And then another thing that I would be excited about would be to give reviewers sort of the power to ask questions and ask for clarifications of researchers about their checklist. And that sort of, this might further push the norm of, well, if you're a researcher, these are questions that you ought to be thinking about, and they're questions that you ought to be taking seriously, because selfishly, you might be asked about it by one of your reviewers, and it'd be awkward if you didn't have a good answer to that. Yeah, so those are some of the things that I wanted to go through, and yeah, I'm very excited to hear some more of your questions about these talks.
Thank you very much, Markus. We do have a question from Ivica Srnkovic. Ivica, would you like to ask it out loud?
Yes. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Very interesting. And I would like to ask you, have you read the answers from the AI researchers from the previous conferences? What was your, what kind of answers they were, what they have written?
Yeah, so I haven't done anything particularly sort of rigorous or scientific. I've just looked at a random set of papers and sort of formed a bit of an impression, but I'll say what that impression was. I guess the impression was, it was more positive than I expected, but maybe that was me starting at a very low level of anticipation. So I was expecting people to write just a few sentences. They would say, oh, it might have an effect on this and that, and I'm sure it'll be fine, and overall it's going to be a good thing for the world. But some of the ones that I read, they looked particularly good. I think the sort of most impressive example that we have in this space is from that year's NERPS conference. OpenAI, they published the results of their GPT-3 model at NERPS, and that paper includes I think it's up to like maybe 5 or 10 pages or something like this that they've written about what the potential impacts of this of their model might be, and they've done a bunch of studies on it, and they've run extra tests on it and that kind of thing. So I think there are a few cases that look really good, but I think for the most part they're kind of short. They're a few sentences, but I was overall positively sort of positive about it. I think one thing that was particularly exciting to see was just like there was this option that you could say, well, no, my research doesn't have enough impact on the world, so I don't need to write this statement. But that was actually a very, very uncommon thing to do. I don't remember the number, but it was maybe something like 90 or sort of at least 70% of people actually wrote something, which I think just in itself is a positive thing. I'm hoping that we'll publish some data on this that will give a bit of a sense. At the very least, that data will include sort of a spreadsheet or the like, where we'll just have collated all of the statements, and so one could go in and just read statement after statement, which I think could be really helpful.
Thank you, Markus. We're running a little bit out of time, but I think we have time for one quick question and a quick answer. Jennifer Renault has a question. Would you like to ask it?
Yes, hi. I think it should be quick. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. I was wondering if among the costs that you have mentioned of such an initiative, do you think there are any that are like, how to say, inherent to this kind of initiative, or are they mostly due to, as you already mentioned, the lack of education from the research community? Because I can see things like quality deficits and negative attitudes towards this kind of initiative could be solved by educating the community into these ethical problems. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you think would be inherent problem to this kind of initiative? Could not be solved with education.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess as one reaction is just like education is, or the kind of education we're talking about here is it's a lot. It's sort of it's a really big process. And so if we were in the world where all AI researchers they held the belief that, well, you know, I bear at least some responsibility for understanding what the impact of my research is. It's worth some of my time to think about that carefully. Yeah, those kinds of beliefs. Then I would expect a lot of these potential costs to be removed. I think the ones that would remain would be, you might still worry about these quality deficits. So you might still think that, like, well, you know, these folks aren't particularly well placed to answer these questions. They're not ethicists. They're experts about sort of particular methods in machine learning. And so maybe they can't provide that much to the debate, but then my retort there will be like, oh, well, in that case, let's have them focus on the sort of inputs to the ethical debate that they're going to be the most well placed to answer. And then the other thing that would still be the case is sort of, yeah, if you still have this belief that, yeah, you know, it's not that valuable, you might still have these worries about sort of you just wasting people's time. And you know, that's it's at least some cost to take into account. But yeah, I think you're right that, like, if we just had a community that had different attitudes here, or had sort of engaged more with these kinds of questions, then you know, a lot of these potential negative effects might be just removed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I saw that there's some questions in the chat. I could pop some thoughts in there as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Markus. Let's give him one more round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.
And now we have time for a coffee break. Let's reconvene again in 17 minutes from now at 3 sharp Swedish time, and we'll hear the third and final talk by Mohammed Abdalla. So see you around then. All right. It's 3 o'clock. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good coffee break. Let me introduce our next speaker, Mohammed Abdalla, who's a PhD student in the Natural Language Processing Group at the Department of Computer Science, University of Toronto. And he holds affiliations with the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence, the Center for Ethics, and ICES, formerly known as the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences. Mohammed will talk to us about the Gray Hoodie Project, big tobacco, big tech, and the threat on academic integrity. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Yeah, so first off, I'd like to thank you for inviting me and thank the listeners for taking time out of your day to be here. You know, as introduced, I'm going to be talking about the Gray Hoodie Project as a paper, which I wrote with my brother while I was at the Center for Ethics, although my main affiliation is with that of the Department of Computer Science. Despite the seemingly polemic title and some of the external discussions surrounding the work's thesis is quite simple and relatively uncontroversial. Simply put, we believe that private interest funding biases research and should be actively studied and controlled. It's important to note that in this specific paper, we solely limit our discussions on the ethics of AI work, which means that we're not talking about you know, the effects of funding on general technical or foundational research, which a lot of machine learning people like to believe or like to say that they believe is separate. Although we do believe that this argument does hold, we try to narrow down our first attempt of convincing people that this is an issue, because if you can't succeed here, then succeeding in the larger one is going to be much harder. The thesis, as stated, is widely accepted as true in many other academic fields, especially the healthcare field, so pharmacy, medicine, life science. However, for some reason, it's viewed as controversial in computer science or AI ethics. And there's some guesses as to why, but nothing certain that I can prove as to why this is the case. So first off, I'd just like to start with a timeline of this work because it sort of helps contextualize a lot of the discussion that I'm going to put here. So this work was done last April, and it was pre-printed in October. And this, at the time when I had done this work, it was a purely theoretical system level analysis of, here are some possible issues or harms that can come from industrial funding. And like when I had written the paper, when I had thought of writing the paper, Timnit hadn't been fired, Margaret Mitchell hadn't been fired, all of these leaks from Google's haven't been fired. Haven't happened. So it was a purely system levels analysis. And unfortunately, I had submitted the paper to one of the largest AI ethics conferences, and it was rejected for being too conspiratorial. So yeah, the views pushed in the paper sort of were viewed as, too extreme until there was so much evidence to the contrary that it was eventually accepted at another AI ethics conference. And this isn't shown only to vent, but it's sort of to highlight that, you need an overwhelming amount of evidence to convince those in computer science that the claims being made in this paper are not really too out there to be seriously considered, and that they are in fact something that we need to, grapple with. And to sort of intuitively explain the issue, I like to lean heavily on this analogy. Imagine if there was a health policy conference with 10,000 plus attendees that was largely funded by big tobacco, and among the variety of topics discussed at this conference was, how do you best deal with the negative effects of increased tobacco usage? Would this funding / research, joint enterprise be accepted? Would it be okay for the largest health policy conference to be funded by big tobacco? And the state of things as they currently are is that it would not be the case. The World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control says that when you're trying to set and implement public health policies with respect to tobacco control, you need to act to protect those policies from commercial interests and other vested interests of the tobacco industry, right? But if you were to switch health policy with machine learning or AI ethics, big tobacco with big tech, and the increased effects of increased tobacco usage with the ethical concerns of increased AI deployment, would this be the case? Would this funding research question be accepted? And the answer is yes. It's not a hypothetical in this case. It's basically the current state of things, as demonstrated by the funding histories of these conferences. And just right here, I'd like to preempt some, instinctive responses that I get when I push this viewpoint. I'm not so subtly implying that big tech's funding in academia is negative like that of big tobaccos. And there's some intuitive responses. The first is that this is an inaccurate analogy, and this is 100% true. It's only accurate in some respects, and it is not appropriate in others. And we'll discuss this later. It's only so far. There's a limit to how far one can take this analogy. Another one, which is sort of, I think comes from the naivety of computer scientists, is that it's sort of like we are aware of the risks, and we should be, people publish their affiliation under their name in the paper, and we'll be able to correct for it post hoc. And I discussed this later on, but there's no reason to believe that this is the case, and there's research indicating otherwise, actually. And then there's many other responses, like sort of whataboutisms. You don't talk about military funding, or you don't talk about this issue, and there's a lot of other issues, but we try to focus on the as narrow a task as possible at the very beginning, before trying to expand to tackle more important or more difficult questions to answer. I think that the best way to cutting to the chase, the best way to prove our thesis to those that may doubt it, is to show that those that we sort of accuse with attempting to influence academia, those that we put this charge towards, actually hold this viewpoint as well. Campaign for Accountability is a non-for-profit in the United States that does work related to the tech industry, and its largest funder at the time of writing this paper was Oracle. Oracle and Google, had been embroiled in lawsuits that went up to the Supreme Court, and in response to some anti-Google work. By anti-Google is basically critical of Google. In response to more critical of Google done by CFA, Google, in their blog post, they publish a blog post and they say that they question the work done by CFA because of their Oracle funding. So if you read the sentence here, in their blog post, Google questions the anti-Google work done by CFA because they are funded by Oracle, which has incentive to hurt Google. If you extract away the proper nouns, what you get, in their blog post, they question the work done by unaffiliated non-for-profit researchers because they are funded by a corporation that has a profit motive. This is essentially the same thesis that we started out with. So, even if other academic computer scientists don't believe in our thesis, industry definitely does. Industry knows that their funding warps research and researchers who accept their funding. So then why did we choose the incorrect big tobacco analogy if we knew that this is the case? Why not, big oil, big pharma, some other large industry? And there's two main reasons for this. One is that there's a really rich literature that we could leverage to basically know what to look for. The amount of literature on big tobacco, I think, outweighs that of any other industry. But the second and more important one, which is why we chose big tobacco over the other ones, is that we wanted to purposely use the negative gut reaction to big tobacco's funding of academia to enable a more critical examination of big tech. Essentially, what we wanted people to ask is that when people read the sort of claims and the problems that we raise in this paper, they come up with solutions, and we want people to ask, would you be comfortable with this solution being raised as a possible fix for big tobacco's funding in academia? And oftentimes we see that this isn't the case. So, like I previously mentioned, one of the most common Twitter responses is that peer review should be able to handle any obvious attempts to influence research. But all existing literature from other fields indicate otherwise. Life science and health policies as a field have peer review. Their peer review is actually more permissive than that of computer science. Computer science conferences tend to be double blind in that neither the reviewers don't know the authors and the authors don't know the reviewers. Whereas in life science, it tends to be single blind, where the reviewers know who the authors are and their affiliations. So if anyone is able to use peer review to sort of adjust after the fact for someone's possible influence or bias or partiality, it should be them. And if they do not believe that they have the capacity to do this, then why do we believe computer scientists have this capacity? And I'm not saying that we don't. I'm a computer scientist. I'd love to have a skill that no other researcher has, but we need research to prove that this skill exists, and it simply isn't there. So why would industry, generally speaking, want to fund academia? And leveraging the history from big tobacco and leaked documents, there's loosely speaking 4 main reasons to fund academia, and you see them listed here. In the paper, we go through each of these 4 points and provide proofs for both big tobacco, big tech, and sort of draw parallels. And what we're claiming here is not that big tech is intentionally attempting to do all of these 4. Rather, we make the claim that regardless of intentionality, if your current behavior allows you to achieve all of these 4 points in tandem, then even if it's unintentional, it should be controlled and studied. So the first reason is the least controversial, and I think everyone agrees with this. It's essentially PR. So the first step, or the largest step that most of these companies do, is to create or fund respectable centers for research on the societal impacts of their product. It's the Partnership for AI, Stanford's HAI. For big tobacco, I couldn't find a logo, so there's quite an ugly picture on the left here. But for big tobacco, that was the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which was later renamed to the Council on Tobacco Research. And for big tech, there's various centers like the PAI, which I'll discuss later, Stanford's HAI. We don't actually know who their funders are because Stanford refuses to disclose who is funding them, which is definitely not a bad sign. And it's important to note that just like they did with big tobacco, when you create such a center, you have to headhunt people that give legitimacy to your center. So they headhunt superstars of the field, or to try to associate themselves with big names in the field, so that they get the veneer of legitimacy. And there is some legitimacy there, but there's also issues with such centers. Basically, the Partnership on AI was an attempt to bring together industry and civil society or public institutions in order to enable a discussion on how AI policy should proceed in the United States. And there was a piece published in The Intercept a couple of years ago, basically where various civil liberties organizations believed that they're basically being railroaded into the decisions made by this partnership, and that they had no say when compared to that of the big companies such as Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And the specific example that they provided here is that when they desire to give a policy recommendation on how to use AI in policing, rather than adopting the near consensus view of civil liberties organization, that this isn't something that we want at all, because of the societal consequences, we don't want this to be automated. They instead went with the industry consensus that this is something that we do want, but there's ways of minimizing the risk. So basically, such partnerships and they practically end up serving a legitimate function to these companies. Another way that you do this is that you choose which research questions are fundable and police the tone of the research that does exist. So in the centers that you fund, or through grants to people not at your centers, you basically choose research questions that pose the least threat to your bottom line. And so long as your reasons and methodology for choosing one research direction over another, you'll get the positive so long as these reasons are hidden, you'll get the positive PR associated with funding research, and and you'll avoid the bad PR that comes with the way that you do it. And this, at the time of writing the initial piece, this had been a theoretical analysis where basically I had showed that Big Tobacco used lawyers and PR to determine who would get PR folks to determine who would get grant funding and who they would simply refuse because they acknowledged that nicotine is addictive or that smoking was dangerous. And at that time, I didn't have proof that any of these companies were doing the same thing, though there was no reason to believe otherwise, given the lack of transparency on their part. After the piece had been published and reporters had reached out to me and to people working at these companies, it ended up being the case that the theoretical analysis was right. The bottom picture on the right here is a tweet from William Fitzgerald. There was a Wired article written about this paper, and in response to this Wired article, Google stated that their collaborations with academic and research institutions are not driven by policy influence in any way. And William, basically, he used to work at PR or in the PR firm or team or whatever they call it at Google. And while he was employed there, he showed that there's an example where they purposefully went after a certain researcher who and a certain publication in order to push a policy viewpoint. So clearly, they're not being the most honest of people. Maybe they forgot about it. And another leak that happened even later was that there was a document that showed that Google, and at least 3 times, forced suggested that authors refrain or police the tone of the work being done. And at this point, there's some pushback here that Google has the right to do what it wants with its own researchers, and this is to some point, to some degree, this is true. But the issue is that there's so many academics who collaborate with Google and their research lab that any sort of censorship that happens on it and their internal research team will always sort of filter or also censor those working in academia as well. And then the last way to appear socially responsible is to present your funding and publication records as proof of goodness. So after Google fired Timnit and they fired Margaret Mitchell, and there was a leak that they policed the tone, and sort of their response all the time would be, oh, but we have published X hundred number of, 100, 200 papers in this topic over this year. And this shows how clearly committed we are to this. And Facebook does the same thing, and Big Tobacco has done the same thing over time. And when done alone, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We do want research in this field. However, when it's used to justify or attempting to offset other unethical actions, then I view this to be a morally bad outcome or morally bad step. So the second reason one would want to influence the events and decisions made by funded university, the second reason one would want to fund academia is so that they can influence events and decisions made by the universities that they fund. So there's 2 ways of doing this, usually done in 2 ways. The first is to use funding as direct leverage, which this is essentially blackmail. I couldn't find an example for big tobacco yet. I'm just waiting for the next meltdown and then leak to happen. But theoretically, there's no reason that these companies wouldn't do it. Essentially, if an institution or a group of people, in this case, I present examples always from my home institution, as to not throw, not to anger people from other institutions, but basically, back in the day, I think in the 1970s or 1980s, the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law students were essential in getting our largest pharmaceuticals brand, store, Shoppers Drug Mart. They had charges laid against them for selling tobacco to minors. And in response, Imperial Tobacco, which is a big tobacco company, withheld its funding from U of T's Faculty of Law conference, something that had been previously consistent up to that point. However, this will trigger a very bad and negative PR reaction. So they tend to avoid this where possible. So the second way to influence events in universities is to plant friendly or sympathetic actors in positions of high power in academia. It's much easier to do this, and it's, there's a lot less negative PR associated with this. And here it's important to note that when I say friendly or sympathetic actors, these actors do not view themselves as compromised. And to use the word compromise is wrong. It is possible that someone not have any financial or any sort of relationship with big tech and yet hold these viewpoints. This is definitely possible, and there's nothing wrong with people holding a different, like an entire spectrum of viewpoints. It's something that we want to encourage at the university. However, the executives at these companies are likely to hold views that are more in line and sympathetic to these companies. So there's an artificial inflation and amplification of people holding viewpoints that are sympathetic to these companies in positions of power. And this is something we don't want. We want basically to maintain the unadulterated distribution of viewpoints rather than narrowing them down to those which are preferred by industry. And I'll provide two examples, one from big tobacco and one for big tech, again, from my own university. So starting with big tobacco, the former president and dean of law at the University of Toronto was a director of a big tobacco company at the same time. So yeah. And then Robert Parker, who was the president for the Canadian Tobacco Manufacturers Council, was also on the board of the foundation of Women's College Hospital, which is the research hospital affiliated with our university. So I'll talk about what effect this has. But and then I'm also affiliated with the Vector Institute, which gets its funding 1/3 from industry. And as faculty / leadership, we've had vice presidents of Google, heads of AI, of NVIDIA, Uber, and many other companies. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's good that we have impact on them, they have impact on us, but there's sort of negative impacts that we need to study and attempt to control. Because the claim is not that bad people are being put in charge, but the views held by the people that are being put in charge are not representative of the views held by society in general, and this is something that we should rectify. The effects of having sort of, people that are sympathetic to industry in positions of power can be either delayed or impotent decisions and weaker or less critical research and or statements. So a sort of controversial example, but I think it's important to discuss, is consider how after the tragic killing I think it was May or June of George Floyd in the United States, Vector, which is a Canadian institution, released a statement condemning police violence and police brutality and the militarization of police and all of this stuff, which is really important and is a good move, and I'm not criticizing that move. I think that, this is something that, we have this issue in Canada as well, and we do want to push for diversity and equity in our field as well. However, when anything happens related to our field, and this is what people look to us for, our government looks to Vector for, views about what is happening in the field. When something happens in our field, in AI, the firing of Timnit Gebru, the revelation that Google's PR and lawyers were involved in framing ongoing work, given the amount of researchers who in Vector currently work and collaborate with Google, no statement is made, there's no public position to be heard. And there's many possible reasons for this. One is that you don't care or you don't view it as a problem. And there are quite a number of, people that hold this view. There's nothing wrong with that. I disagree, but there's nothing wrong with that. Two, you don't want to risk upsetting 1/3 of your income stream because it's not a smart thing to do. And I totally understand that. I just think it's wrong to do. Or the third one is that you're not aware of these issues. And this is, possible, but I doubt it. The third reason and the main thesis, the main contribution of our work is we show how it is possible by funding academia to influence the research questions and plans of individual scientists. And here we say that, regardless of intentionality, if you're able to do this, then, that should raise red flags and we should attempt to stop this from happening. How does this work? Essentially by acting as a pseudo-granting body, industry can direct the majority of research in the field towards an unthreatening direction or block threatening directions. So how has this manifested itself previously? First, I'll go for big tobacco. Basically, big tobacco actively sought out to fund any research that sought to shift the blame of lung cancer from tobacco and secondhand smoke to other sources. And they also had a big pool of funds, that they would push basic cancer research as opposed to health effects of cancer, health effects of tobacco on cancer research. So they're technically still doing cancer research and they're getting the positive PR from that while minimizing the amount of research done that links their product with that of cancer. They also had very aggressive actions. So on the right here, you see a ad that they took out in a newspaper to sort of attempt to attack research done by researchers, to sort of bully unfriendly researchers, make it a hostile environment so that academics who aren't well established are less likely to take stances critical of industry. And on the left here, you see there was a letter between Philip Morris and people in the government, and basically they were colluding to ensure that the continuing resolution will include language to prohibit funding for both X and Y, or X and Y are, scientists who took stances that are critical of big tobacco. I don't have any proof of as malicious action from big tech, but to those working in the field, it's clear that a lot of research is funding by these companies, and regardless of intention, they do affect the questions that we work on. And I'd even push that regardless of intention means that it's possible for them to have a bad intention. I argue that this can happen without malintention from either side. So, those working in Silicon Valley are more likely to believe in the views that are espoused by these companies, meritocracy, technical solutionism, other Silicon Valley centric viewpoints. And therefore, grant applications to these companies, so people that try to get money from these companies, these applications are more likely to be approved if they hold the viewpoints that are held by the people working at these companies. So applications that hold the views that that hold these views are more likely to be selected because they don't challenge the underlying assumptions of the people working at these companies or the selection committees. And as this process happens year after year, because every year they have grants to researchers, this will become obvious to applicants who will then face pressure to mold their application such that it fits or at least does not challenge the viewpoints of these companies. Because as a researcher, one of the biggest ways that you get evaluated is on your ability to bring in money. And you're no good as a researcher if you don't have, if you get fired. So there's pressure to conform. And therefore, even without malintent, these people don't have to actively be trying to skew the field. Without this intention, it still ends up happening. So to sort of study how much influence there could be, we surveyed the CVs of computer science faculty at these 4 schools. So 2 of them are private, 2 public, 2 East Coast, 2 West Coast on the North America, on our side of the Atlantic. And we define big tech as companies that are very active on our side of the Atlantic. So if one wants to do this research for Europe, you'd probably have to change the list a little bit. This is controversial to some degree. It's unclear what makes a company big enough to be considered. Like, is Yahoo still big? Is Disney a tech company? Because they both provide funding to researchers. So this is not a definitive list, but this is sort of what we had arrived at. Adding more companies would only strengthen the conclusion. And so long as you don't remove one of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, or Amazon, the conclusions don't really change. So then for all of these CVs, we went through each of them where we could find them. Many researchers do not have their CVs or funding information available online. We asked 5 questions. Do they work on AI? Do they work on ethics of AI? Have they gotten any faculty funding from big tech? So this is awards or grants from companies that's directly for research. Did they get graduate funding from big tech? So was any portion of this faculty's graduate education funded by big tech? And were they ever employed by big tech? So here employment means direct employment, internship, consultation, or like a sabbatical or at big tech. So what we present here, so the bar graph here is the percentage of computer science faculty who have received direct research funding or direct grants or direct funding for academic research in their career. So we see that 52% of all computer science faculty have received such funding. And when looking at CS faculty who work on AI ethics, 58% of them have received funding. If we take the most conservative approach and assume that everyone who has applied has gotten such funding and no one who has not applied has not gotten such funding, then at minimum, 58% of faculty who work in AI and AI ethics look towards these companies as a sort of funds and are therefore possibly influenced by these companies, which is, over, it's over half, which means basically half the field is possibly compromised. I don't like the word compromised, but there isn't really, I guess, influenced, possibly influenced. If we expand the search to any past financial relationship, so here we bring in, past employment or graduate funding, the percentage of faculty skyrockets on all 3, and the percentage of CS faculty who've had any past financial relationship to these companies is 97%. Here, I'd like to clarify that the claim being made, for this graph at least, isn't that your graduate funding or what you did in an internship 10 years ago is going to affect your research direction 10 years down the line as a professor. Rather, it is a clear demonstration that everyone in the field, myself included, I did intern at one of these companies, is exposed to the internal logics of Silicon Valley. And through repeated exposure, we are more likely to adopt these viewpoints. And since we're getting paid by them, there's sort of a positive sentiment to the interaction. So we're more likely to be partial to them, give them the benefit of the doubt when they don't deserve it. And this will skew the research direction and the viewpoints of those working in academia away from the general publics. And the last reason one would want to discover, to fund academia, is to discover receptive academics who can be leveraged. And leveraging an academic is to use them to directly influence policy or legislation or in litigation. And this is done usually in 2 ways. It's you fund researchers who hold industry sympathetic views, artificially amplifying their reach and normalizing their viewpoints, or you use researchers in legal and political spheres without highlighting the financial involvement. For big tobacco, this is pretty normal for them to do. Basically, they would actively seek out researchers who had sympathetic viewpoints, and they had a pool of money for these researchers. And when legislators in Europe started catching on, these companies would then attempt to find sympathetic scientists who they had not previously funded, or there was no previous connection to them. So indirect funding could have been possibly there in order to use them to testify. So they're very, they're very aware of what they're doing, and they know that it works. And big tech, we sort of have, they operate in a similar manner. So Eric Schmidt, previously of Google, was advised on which academic AI ethicist Schmidt's private foundation should fund. And I'm sure that when he was asking which AI ethicist, he was asking for, purely, no reason about whether or not they matched his viewpoints, but rather about the quality of their work and whether or not they were productive. And we have multiple examples with Eric Schmidt, again, CEO of Google, whether or not he should fund a certain professor who later served as an expert consultant to the Pentagon's Innovation Board. So we have, a history of academics being leveraged by big tech. More examples. There was the example that I showed previously, where the previous former Google employee in their PR department basically disproved or refuted the claim that their collaborations are not driven by policy influence in any way. There's also investigative work by the New Statesman, which uncovered researchers were awarded money for holding industry sympathetic views, forgot to disclose set of words while continuing to publish in the field, and were cited by those who had funded them without making it obvious that they had funded this research. So, clearly the public-facing actions of big tech and big tobacco are similar. However, without litigation, it is impossible to prove, malintent. However, going off leaks is not, too hard to imagine. And even without malintent, I would argue that, action needs to be taken. But I'll evaluate the analogy. First of all, it's important to note that big tech is not equal to big tobacco. Big tech is largely considered to be a net positive impact on the world. Not as much in this, in the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years. But, like the search engine is a good innovation, most people would argue. The instant communication, people would argue is a good, some may disagree, but I think largely speaking, net positive. But the difficulty comes in also evaluating their harms. The harms of tobacco usage is increased death and increased lung cancer, which is quite easy to count. It's difficult to prove that it comes from big tobacco because there's a lot of confounders that you have to adjust for. But the negative effects of these algorithms are not very obvious. It's much more difficult to, quantify or prove the, disruption in the social fabric that comes as a result of these algorithms. And there's people at these companies that do not believe that their companies or their algorithms are responsible for this. Another thing that I sort of didn't like having to do is that reading this work, it sort of seems that the implication is that those taking money or being affiliated with these companies are sort of bad actors, and this isn't at all the case. In truth, if you want to do critical work about big tech, oftentimes you have to be granted access by them to their systems. So if you want to study the effects of, Facebook's recommendation algorithm, the best place to do this is with access to their system. And you have to basically you have to open yourself up to that conflict of interest because there currently isn't a mechanism for unaffiliated researchers to do such research. But I think, legislation could make this possible. And we discussed 2 possible solutions to this, which is sequestration or bifurcation. This is a very short-term solution, which is basically, if you want to work on AI ethics, you cannot receive funding from big tech. I think that there's sort of issues here with with this requirement is that 1, it will reduce the amount of research being done. 2, those working on foundational research or more technical research, which requires much more resources, may then be silenced because they have to take big tech funding for their main job. And we don't want to say you're either an ethicist or you're a technologist. We want people to be able to do both. But in the short term, this is something that could be studied, possibly. Another one is to have institutional requirements, policies that forbid direct funding of researchers. So companies cannot choose individuals. They can only possibly, provide to a pool of money, and academics among themselves will decide how this money is split up. Sort of like how the National Science Foundation works in the US or NSERC works in Canada. And those are the possible solutions. But there's a lot more discussions to be had. This paper wasn't really about solutions, but rather highlighting the problem. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. These are troubling questions, and I'm sure we have questions from the audience. We have a first question from Ivica Slankovic. Would you like to ask it, Ivica?
Yes. Thank you. Of course, this is very for a discussion. These questions, and my question is, if you say that the researcher should not be funded by industry because they get influenced by that funding, what are the other sources? Do you think that other sources are better, like government, Department of Defense, for example, or politicians which are run by, by the next elections? So you will never find like ideal source of funding.
Yeah, so I agree there's like limitations with all sorts of funding, but I also sort of hold the view that I'm not sure how it works in Sweden, but in Canada there's sort of federal organizations that are run by academics that get, like, you know, the government will give them $500 million each year, and they will decide how to distribute this among all of the researchers in that field. And I agree that, you know, relying on government funding isn't necessarily, one, is decreasing, or at least not increasing in proportion to the amount of money required to do research. And two, like, yes, politicians have their own viewpoints and their own agendas, but unlike companies, you know, since we live, like, you know, in liberal democracies, we have the ability to change our politicians and to, you know, they're accountable to us to some degree, whereas these companies are not accountable to us at all. With respect to military funding, this isn't really an issue in Canada. It's quite common in the United States, where many researchers do get funding from the military. And, you know, it's very hard to say my own viewpoints without coming across as holier than thou, or like making a moral judgment. Like, I think that, you know, one should try to avoid military funding when possible, but this may not always be the case. And like, it's sort of a decision that everyone has to make by themselves. There isn't like a right answer. And I just think that, you know, we need to work towards finding better solutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed.
I mean, it's not a simple answer to that. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there further questions? Please feel free to ask. So one spontaneous reaction that I have is, have you received pushback from big tech companies themselves, or are you otherwise worried that this might negatively impact your career?
Yes-ish. No direct negative impact. This will all happen during COVID, so I guess those that don't like me just wouldn't reach out. But like, I have been following a lot of the Twitter discussion, and there's been quite a lot of negative reactions to my work. But, you know, that's expected. It would be surprising if no, like, you know, even with quite uncontroversial work, there's, you know, detractors. Like, do I worry that it may affect future job prospects? Possibly. Like it's something that's, it's in the back of my mind, but at the same time, you know, I wouldn't want to go to a place like, you know, I wouldn't want to work in an institution that requires me not to be able to speak about what I want to speak about. So it's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Question from Jennifer.
Yes.
Jennifer, we lost your microphone.
Sorry, I have to examine myself because my husband has a meeting at the same time. Thank you for the very interesting talk. And I think it's an extremely important and complex problem to discuss, obviously. It's not so much a question than a comment, but it feels to me that we discuss a lot about what big tech can influence individual research work or even common research work, which is a very important thing to do. But at the same time, I feel that there is also, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because there might be a big overlap between people who are kind of sensible to big tech views and therefore more likely to work for them. So it's a bit, there is this big loop between, oh, big tech is fueled by people who believe in their views and in reaction might influence another kind of research. So it's a bit, I don't really have a question for that. I just felt I wanted just to raise a bit this fact, basically.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And it's sort of an issue that's, you know, shared by many fields. Like, you know, for example, financial regulation is often a revolving door between those that work in the finance, like in the biggest banks or whatever country, and the government. It's sort of very difficult to, it's sort of a natural tendency, I agree. But I think that sort of makes it even more of a requirement that we need to figure out systems or put sort of boundaries on conditions that happen. Yeah, there isn't like
I
a.
completely agree, definitely, but it's definitely a very complex problem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we're out of time. Let's thank Mohammed again for his excellent presentation. And there will be more room for discussion during the concluding panel, which starts in 8 minutes. So let's take a very quick 8-minute break and then be back for the panel. See you all then.
Question. There will be some time at the end for questions. You can write your questions in the chat and I'll try to keep an eye on what's posted there. If you want to direct it to a particular panelist, you can also put that in the chat, so it's easier to know. Okay, so I will start with a question directed maybe mostly towards Markus and Matthijs. So as a more personal technical side, there seems to be a bit of a split between the pure technical scholars and the AI ethicists. How do you think we can begin to bridge this gap?
Yeah, I guess I titled my paper "Bridging the Gap," so I should. I think there's one thing I find of interest around this question is that sort of research communities and academic communities are, of course, like for good reasons, there's sort of specialization and sort of areas of focus, and there's a sense of sort of specialization and interfragmentation. And there's many lines that you can draw across that. And so one line that was sort of discussed and contested a bit, sort of there's like near term, long term. There are maybe many more equally sort of relevant or equally sort of salient other sort of lines that you could draw, or distinctions, including between sort of scholars that are already more, whether technical scholars or political scholars that are already more engaged on sort of the ethics of this technology, or more focused sort of on doing the research and leaving the ethical debates to someone else. And so I have a lot of uncertainty over the degree to which it's sort of people or scientists that have less of an existing interest in ethical debates sort of should be compelled to engage in them anyway. At the same, so I think there's one sort of group of people that would be sort of interested, which is like who are sort of technical researchers who are also interested in this already, and so that would be it would be interesting to think of institutional mechanisms to help them then sort of think about how to structure their investigations into the ethical impact of their research, or how to talk to policy experts. It's a separate debate over the degree to which we should promote, or like one should promote, a general sense of sort of ethical engagement amongst researchers. And of course, there are arguments to that extent, where it's like also including at the educational level, having courses that focus on ethics in AI education. And then very practically, how to promote sort of interaction. I know there's projects that have to do with sort of clarifying like terminology or clarifying sort of like the underlying concepts and having a sort of a rubric that people can talk across and understand what people talk about when they talk about fairness in a technical context or in a sort of ethical context. So something that helps in translating, in sort of talking across that and avoiding some of the misunderstandings around that. Yeah, I would be interested in seeing more of a range of, 4 of our people are invited to do that. I guess one sort of preliminary thing could be just sort of to emphasize, maybe for AI researchers, that there is, of course, like plenty of precedent in other scientific fields for researchers getting involved in the ethical debates and in the ethical sort of policy discussions. And so I guess I also want to clarify to many researchers and scientists that this is sort of this may be in a sense, a historically normal sort of next step or phase in the development of any scientific field, or especially when a field becomes extremely societally relevant, that scientists are called upon to have those discussions. I don't think there's a very concrete solution for you to sort of block that gap quite yet, but I'm happy to maybe hear my fellow panelists on this now.
Yeah, I think, I agree that there's some just like natural reasons we should expect to be in this kind of situation, in particular just because of the self-selection that's going on. So if I choose to research AI research, it's because I'm excited about the possibility of this work and the kinds of things that we might make happen in the world. And then on the other hand, if I'm sort of researching the sort of potential ways in which AI might be sort of harmful to society, then like presumably that's also going to have certain self-selection pressures where those folks will be particularly interested in, or sort of might have higher credences on those these technologies leading to potential problems. I think that being said, I think there's been like a decent amount of progress even over the past few years. I think we've seen a decent amount of progress where my sort of vague impression is that sort of maybe a few years ago, maybe like 5 years ago or so, a lot of AI researchers would have quite a kind of a gut reaction against claims that this technology might lead to sort of bad outcomes in the world. And I think that's kind of a natural reaction to have, just in the sense of like, from sort of a sociological perspective, in that like my sort of livelihood is being sort of questioned, and sort of the thesis upon which I'm like basing my life is being questioned, and so that's going to lead to a certain reaction. But I do think that like we're now at a stage where most sort of prestigious AI researchers, they'll be saying things like, this research, it can be used for a bunch of things. Some of those things will be bad. We should do something to avert that. And we should do research to make sure that those uses are sort of are minimized. And I think that's just a bunch of progress. It's true that there's sort of more progress to go. And I think that progress that's needed kind of comes from both ends of the spectrum, where sort of ethics researchers presumably should sort of be better at sort of engaging with sort of the actual research and sort of knowing where it's at, and sort of being better versed in sort of what are the actual ways in which this technology might lead to harms in the world. And on the sort of AI researcher side, I think just like making people feel more comfortable with the idea that, if your technology is important, then some of the uses that it might be put to might be bad. Just seems important, and I think that progress is sort of happening. I think one thing in particular that's important is to sort of do something to counteract this sort of threat model, or sort of counteract that kind of reaction on the part of AI researchers, in terms of just sort of reframing this as, I think one good thing is just like reframing a lot of these discussions as what's the different kind of AI research that we ought to be doing, as opposed to making it seem like the discussion is about let's do less AI research. And yeah, so I think that's one thing that could be done more of, and maybe the way to do that, if you're one of these folks thinking about the potential risks of this technology, is just to sort of engage more with AI researchers and sort of always push towards like, okay, well, what are the actual sort of technical fixes that we could put in place, or what are the actual sort of institutional changes that we might want to put in place?
Thank you. I don't know, Mohammed, do you want to comment on this as well?
I mean, like, I don't have as much experience as either of them, and I can only speak for the pure academic side of things. But I think the biggest, like, there's no structural incentives for technical people to work with non-technical people, and for non-technical people to work with technical people. For example, like this work that I did here, right? Like, this doesn't qualify as part of my thesis. It's not considered computer science work. So like I sort of, you know, I do this on the side as a hobby. It sort of gets in the way of my real work because there's no way for the institution to, yeah, there isn't an institutionalized benefit to doing any sort of this work. And I assume the same is like the case for an ethicist who does really technical work. Like in computer science, if it's not a methodological contribution, it's not a contribution. And on the ethical side, I assume if it's only a technical contribution, then it's not a contribution. So it's sort of, and like, you know, our publishing, like computer science, you know, conferences, you're expected to publish at minimum every year or once every 2 years. You can't really critically think about what you're doing if you're expected to publish twice a year. But then if you choose to take the time to critically think and engage with scholars that, like, you know, to computer scientists work at a slower pace, but in reality, it's because you're required, you need that time to work to critically think about what you're doing. Then, like, you know, I risk my tenure, I risk my promotion, I risk my career. And I think that, you know, there's like, you know, that's sort of, you know, the structure doesn't encourage this. So that's why it's sort of, even if people want to do it, they can't.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And it's like a really, really important part of the dynamics here. One thing that I didn't mention about this like broader impact statement stuff that I was particularly excited about would be if you could get to a world where you could get a lot of citations for saying good things about what the impact of certain AI technologies might be. So in the ideal world, it's the case that, you know, everyone writes these statements about what the impacts of this technology might be, or this particular ML technique might be, or whatever, and then people will find the canonical impact statement on this particular technology, on like bandit algorithms or whatever it might be, and then we can sort of, you know, use the sort of these dynamics in favor of getting a bunch of citations sort of in favor of more work in this area. And maybe we could do that with other things, or if we can like push more towards this norm in like when people write their motivation sections, they're like, you know, maybe they cite the canonical paper on the potential impacts of their ML technique or whatever they're working on.
Right. So let's move on to a slightly different question. So in AI, a lot of the big advances in research recently has been done by big companies. So can we get these, is it realistic to get these companies to reflect about the future applications of their research in something like an impact statement? Maybe that's business secrets. Maybe they don't want to reveal any negative potential impacts. If I start with you, Markus, and then maybe Mohammed want to come into.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very excellent question. One of the things that I was particularly keen to look for, like that I want to know about these broader impact statements that we have from last year is, do we see a pattern where folks who work at labs, they say fewer things that are potentially negative that might come out of their research? In particular, because you can imagine if you're a company, you might be like, oh, well, if it sounds really, really bad, it would sound really bad for Facebook, for example, if like in 2010, some of their researchers were saying like, oh, maybe our research will undermine democracy. And that might not be a great PR story for them. And I think that we have, I don't know what the data says. I think there are other reasons to suggest that like this would happen, which is like, to my knowledge, most of the sort of AI labs folks that I talked to, for a lot of them, there was someone at the company who was responsible for reviewing the broader impact sections that folks submitted. I don't know if they would like, you know, actually reviewed all of them, but I think at the very least you would expect a push in favor of not saying things that might be harmful down the line. And yeah, I think this is a real problem, and I think we should expect we should expect the better answers about the impacts of these kinds of technologies to not come from folks who have a vested interest in sort of making sure that they're rolled out. So if we could make sure that kind of research is funded and it's funded by independent resources, that seems great. I guess we have some sort of examples that I feel are sort of counterexamples. So I think OpenAI's work with GPT-3 and sort of their impact statements there, I think it's like really commendable. And I think that like a thing, sort of a duty that we have as the sort of community of people who are trying to steer this this field in the right direction is to just like, you know, throw praise at companies when they do things that look that is responsible practice. And in the ideal scenario, we throw enough praise and whatnot at these companies that sort of it might actually be in their interest to be really responsible about these kinds of things. At the very least, like I don't know if we could actually get to that world, but I think we could actually at least like move towards that world if we sort of push towards it.
Yeah, like I'm a very cynical person when it comes to this. I don't think we can expect them to be very honest. They can pay lip service, but I don't think it will change sort of what they do. And there's also a harm in taking their work at face value. Like Google, for example, has a history of policing the tone or the concerns that are raised by their work. And there's no, and you know, Facebook has had internal research that shows that, you know, they ruin democracies, or there's like some internal Facebook research that shows like, you know, they increase polarization as a result of their algorithms. And I'm sure that they'll list the trivial ones, but I don't think you can trust them to list the ones that we would care most about. But I think that, you know, there's other ways of getting around this. You know, you could, you know, through legislation, force that, you know, sort of destroy the idea of a trade secret and force them to open themselves up to researchers, independent researchers, to sort of evaluate their algorithms. It depends on the political willpower at the current time. But yeah, I don't trust them to do it themselves. And so long as their products have an impact on society, they need to be regulated somehow.
Yeah. Maybe briefly, I think one thing, so I could think of sort of a weak case where there are cases such as, a range of tech companies, like where there's sort of like a more an aligned interest in things like, the cybersecurity standards, or sort of the ability to spoof certain systems with adversarial input, where. And then, of course, you could be, if you squint a bit, it's sort of like, right, you could get companies to think more about like, well, we assume there's going to be good cybersecurity, we assume they're going to be resilient, or there's not going to be attackers. But if you sort of get the institutional incentives right, they would have an incentive at thinking about and potentially anticipating the impacts of having not fully secured or not or sort of vulnerable AI systems in a range of public spaces and applications. But I think I share maybe some of the uncertainty over whether that would extend to many other types of impacts in terms of sort of, there are, some cases. So I think I seem to recall that there was Axon, which was they supplied like the police departments had a sort of their ethics review board had a internal review where they actually paused or put a moratorium on the delivery of facial recognition to police departments before sort of the murder of George Floyd last year. And as like after that, a number of other companies made the same move, but I think this came earlier. I'm less familiar what went on in that process. To what extent that sort of, I think it mostly was about a discussion over the limited accuracy of certain types of facial recognition in some cases. And so it was less, yeah, less a sort of downstream impact assessment of like, oh, if we do this, then 5 years down the line, the technology might do that. There, I mean, I guess, and this is why maybe personally I would put more stock by, yeah, extended impact assessments that don't, like maybe include companies, but definitely go beyond that. And there's some interesting work by a colleague of mine, Jess Whittlestone and Zoe Kramer at, I think the Future of Humanity Institute, to have looked at sort of inclusive and participatory methods for sort of forecasting early warning signs of changes in AI capabilities and how those could impact in different areas of society. And so I would recommend that also, if this is not taking it too far afield from your question, Dr. Johansson.
Yeah. So actually, Matthijs, maybe we'll stay with you for my next topic. You can start. So you spoke about getting this agreement between long-term and short-term ethical risks. And now we talked about mostly the risks with big tech gaining a lot of influence. But do you see your approach, is it possible to use it to get some sort of productive consensus where society, academia, and big tech perhaps can have some common interests using the approach you suggested in your talk?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, actually. You mentioned that where there's an interesting sort of asymmetry almost, where on the one hand, you could have an argument that while there is going to be more disagreement over what risks are the one to be sort of mitigating first, or whether even all of these things are risks, we might have more agreement where it's like a positive sum, and where many stakeholders stand to gain. So it's just things like the debates over the use of AI systems in conflict prevention, monitoring human rights violations, or I think something like the research agenda on using these systems to mitigate climate change. And so there could be, and if you took one of those projects, I think there could be grounds for that being broadly beneficial from both a near-term, quote unquote, and a long-term perspective. And actually, one of my sort of personal interest, one is some of the recent work by so Alan Dave from FHI and other teams on cooperative AI. So areas where AI systems could support various forms of cooperation. There's other interesting work, and so my background in international law, it looks more at how AI systems, if used in various aspects of treaty creation or monitoring, could contribute to the legitimacy of international law, although even there are failure modes if these tools remain restricted to only a few powerful actors rather than being deployed very widely. I guess there is an interesting aspect to which, like, seizing positive opportunities and not just sort of averting risks or averting sort of market failures or sort of information failures, but so orienting towards positive opportunities could be a interesting scenario that could lead to agreement in the near term and long term. Although I also wonder to what extent people also may have sort of a different sense of what they think are the most meaningful good uses that they would really like to see this technology used for, and also maybe a sense of the different credences that people have, different researchers, over how viable different types of AI for good approaches will prove being. There has been some work discussing that, sort of like talking not about bridging the gap between sort of the AI ethics community, but talking about bridging the gap between sort of different national or like sort of ethics communities. So the sort of European American AI ethics community and the Chinese ethics community. There's been some discussion about how to sort of work across those sort of gaps, and there's been some discussion there over like a lot of that could focus on areas such as the use of AI in sustainability, although that of course comes with a question of, given also some concerns over other types of AI ethics challenges that arise from Chinese users of AI, whether that is something that you could get a large enough community to want to participate in. Yeah. So sorry, a bit of a sprawling answer, but I hope that answered your question.
Markus, Mohammed, do you have any? Do you see any areas of consensus where we should work for seizing the opportunities?
Like consensus between like, yeah, what policymakers might want, society, like society as a whole, academia, industry.
Yes, all of the above.
Right. Yeah, I think probably, I think at the very least, like we're gonna see more and more of it in the as time goes on. I guess like a very simple thing is, I think we have a decent amount of consensus, at least like in between some of these actors in, like, for example, in the US, of just like, oh, it turns out that like investing a bunch in this field is a thing that we all want. And so I would expect that to be one overlap across the things. I think we also do have one a sort of a big set of overlap of interests, which is something like making sure that AI is a technology that is trusted by folks, in particularly by folks sort of in Western countries, where there might be a risk that sort of the public loses trust in this kind of technology and therefore doesn't end up adopting it. I think that is a real risk, and I think more and more all of these actors, and I guess in this case the actor that you might be so the most cynical of would be companies, whether they have an interest in favor of this kind of thing. And my guess is that they do actually have this interest. And in particular, like one way to frame this that I quite like is there's some risk that sort of AI will go the way of GMOs, for example, where GMOs, sort of from a scientific perspective, has a really great promise, but we've ended up in a sort of a disequilibrium where, at least in most of the Western world, where we're not using this, or at least in Europe, we're not using this technology. And so if I were working for an AI lab or an AI company, then I'd be really scared of this happening to AI. And then the further question is, well, do these actors actually know that this is in their interest, and do they act in accordance with that? Like, for example, they might be sort of focusing on have just a shorter term view of sort of what they ought to be doing, and so that might cause them problems. But my guess is, at least to a decent extent, at least some companies, I feel, do actually internalize this view, and they do try to push for at least some regulation that would move in favor of this direction. And I think a lot of sort of government folks that I've spoken to, at least sort of who have some connection to the US and the UK, do kind of buy this narrative that sort of ensuring public trust is really important. And I guess at the very least, we should expect some kind of correlation between public trust and the extent to which sort of the technology is actually trustworthy. And I think that's at least, there's at least some hope comes from that correlation being strong enough. And so yes, I think that there are a decent number of overlaps. But then I think we should expect there to be a bunch of ways in which there aren't particularly good overlaps.
Thank you. Mohammed, do you have anything to add, or?
Not really. I'm not as well educated as these guys are on, as many stakeholders. I'm very narrow in my study. Yeah.
I was thinking from you're coming from a bit more of a technical perspective. If there's anything you see that you would really want to get across to, say, the general public.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I don't disagree with anything that either of them have said. I sort of echo their responses. Nothing novel to add. I think it's very difficult to get something that everyone agrees on. But there's a lot of topics that most people agree on, and that should be good enough. Like even when Matthijs said, for example, that security, or I think it was security or cyber security stuff, something of that sort. Yeah. Like I agree that companies and the public want this, but many, law enforcement and policymakers often do not want this, right? They're always pushing for, removing of encryption and such. So I think it's very difficult to get complete agreement, but I don't think we need to get majority agreement sort of thing.
Thank you. Right, so we'll move on a little bit, and talk. I know Olle wanted to say a few words about what we're doing at Chalmers and within the chair program in terms of AI ethics. So Olle, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So this meeting is organized by the AI Ethics Committee, which I'm chairing, at the Chalmers AI Research Center. And one of our motivations for doing the workshop is to try and understand how can we best achieve our overarching goal of making sure that the work done at Chalmers on AI is benign to society, and how to make ethical and social consequences perspective permeate all of the AI research done here. So let me just quickly mention two of the main things that we're doing in this AI Ethics Committee. One is that we are organizing this sort of meeting, and we have a regular AI ethics seminar. This is meant to help spread the word among AI researchers at Chalmers and elsewhere. Of course, the problem with this is that the audience is largely self-selected, so maybe we're preaching to the choir to an extent. Another thing we're doing is kind of the same thing that Markus talked about, this NeurIPS initiative, because we have a lot of calls for project proposals, internal calls at chair, and we require all the applications there to do something like an impact statement about this, and then we evaluate that. But the experience so far is a little bit mixed. It's not so easy to get everyone on board with the kind of consequentialist thinking that we need. So I would be very, very interested to get any kind of advice about what we should be doing to help Chalmers' impact on the world to become even more positive than it has been so far.
Thank you, Olle. Right, so I don't know if the three panelists in a few minutes want to give a couple of short words of advice to Chalmers. What do you think we should absolutely get in our AI policy? Who wants to start?
I feel like I have an obligation to say something, but I don't know if I have anything particularly helpful to say. It seems like a good thing to be doing, to sort of require these kinds of statements. I think it seems right that I would expect, I wouldn't expect people to be sort of in a position to write sort of very, very detailed ones. And I think, especially if you're requiring folks to sort of write out the sort of the consequentialist case for or against their research, that's going to be particularly difficult, I think, both because people might differ in values, and also because it's just whenever whenever you're trying to figure out what the consequences of something might be, you need to predict a bunch of things about how the world's going to go, which means it's very difficult. Yeah, I think that's the thing. I guess one thing that I'm curious about and haven't engaged with a whole bunch, but I think would be useful is just more work trying to figure out, well, okay, how do we best start conversations with folks who are who aren't used to having conversations about what the impacts of their research might be, or what the impacts of sort of AI might be on the world, and sort of starting to develop best practices and whatnot on that, and maybe spreading that sort of to the rest of the world seems like a thing I'd be excited about. I think you would be in a good position to do it, sort of having Olle, for example, who's an expert on these kinds of things. And yeah, I think it's probably something that'd be quite valuable to the world.
Thank you. Matthijs, Mohammed, do you want to comment?
Go ahead, Matthijs. Okay. Yeah, I mean, like it's very hard to like I don't think I'm in a position to be giving advice to a center. But sort of a sort of point to the sort of ethics statement is that at least in my viewpoint, having read quite a few and talked to people that have done this, the benefit isn't necessarily in the result of what is written. Rather, it's in the process of being forced to think about the outcomes. And I think that, even if it's not necessarily good, it's sort of like a practice, practice makes perfect kind of thing. So just because the initial feedback is bad, I think this isn't necessarily a sign that it isn't successful. In fact, if all the feedback was positive, then you likely haven't challenged anyone, and therefore it probably wasn't actually successful in terms of your goals. But yeah, and in terms of just general advice, I don't have any sort of. Yeah, like it's too difficult to come up with general advice.
I guess it would be one thing would be well, I have a very practical answer, which is more like a tool thing that I came across a couple years back, which is called like the moral IT card deck, which is just a very playful way for people to think through various types of impact. It's a bit more focused on sort of like relatively direct sort of impacts and of like deployed systems. It's a bit like, right, oh, of course you're going to have good cybersecurity, but what if your app leaked? How embarrassed would your clients be, and things like that, and a lot of other sort of questions to do with sort of the impacts on privacy, fairness, and others. And then on the, I guess I would also be interested, so to a bit what Markus and Mohammed were saying. I'd be interested if there were at some point more like sort of visible or public testimonials of AI researchers that, yeah, went through sort of an assessment or thinking about that and then hit on a possible concern. And then, and that not necessarily being a sort of like, oh, we stop, but potentially having a sort of like essentially something where it's like someone is like, right, looking back, that changed the direction of my research, or perhaps sort of the way that we sort of implemented this, or we sought to, yeah, consult with a number of the people in the communities that this would be used on, and in the end, our product or our research is the better for it, and the and sort of more refined for it. In the same way that, so what I'm reminded thereof is in sort of some of my work on sort of international law, there's a lot of work on there's a lot of work and attention, understandably, when the laws are violated, and so there's work of like, oh yeah, the laws of war were being violated by this military, and of course it's important. But there was an interesting project a few years back by the International Red Cross, which is basically trying to highlight a lot of the situations in which militaries actually go out of their way to abide by the laws of war, even if it's to their sort of like local tactical disadvantage, as a way of sort of like emphasizing to people that this is a norm that people in this sort of industry or community, okay, in this case militaries, sort of do actually take serious, and it's not only sort of it's always sort of like disregarded. And I think having a number of a more visible cases or examples of people who were able to sort of scrutinize, either, as Mohammed mentioned, like their funding, or able to scrutinize the impacts. That could be an interesting thing for the longer term for the AI community. I don't know if that really gives you something very actionable as a center to look on in the near term, but yeah, I'll have a think. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, all of you. I think we can open up the floor now to some audience questions. I think there was one that came a little while ago in the chat. I'm just going to find it. I think we can just do it. We're not very many, so you can. So Patricia Gamboa, if you want to ask would you like to ask your questions to the panelists?
I would like to ask you, what are your thoughts on moving towards an approach that is less focused on guidelines for ethics in AI, since this has been made very clear. There are a lot of groups nowadays working in this topic. And shouldn't we as researchers be more interested in ensuring that there are some regulatory and some better laws and independency in auditing this kind of questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so I fully agree. I sort of think that, you know, everyone puts out their own guidelines on how to do ethical AI because it's good PR and doesn't require you to actually do anything. It's, you know, it's just some nice words that don't require any follow through. And I think that, yeah, sort of like what I hinted at near the end of my talk is basically there needs to be ways for researchers to audit algorithms in deployment without being part of the corporations that have deployed these algorithms, so that they're not, you know, they don't have to worry about their careers if they find something bad, essentially. And I think that's required. But the way that you would arrive at this is different depending on where you are. Like, you know, Europe's regulations and regulatory frameworks very different from that of Canada, is very different from that of the US. So it's much harder to sort of say how one would arrive at this thing, but I think it is something that is required. But even then, I think it's a much harder discussion to have because you have to stray away from the, you know, the abstract. It's an important discussion to have, but you have to stray away from the abstract, which then makes it much harder to get people to agree on specifics. For example, you know, most people agree that in principle that freedom of speech or freedom of, you know, like, you know, is a good thing. But when you come to define it in specific regulation, you know, what limitations you want to place on it, different countries have different, you know, definitions of what it means for speech to be free to some degree. Like the Americans have the total free for all. You know, and it's less so free for all in Canada and less so in other places as well. So I think it's much harder to have an international discussion on how one would regulate these companies because it's very dependent on the specific locale that this regulation is happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. I guess like one, I think I agree with the general thrust of like, yeah, we need like a bunch of other measures other than companies doing self-regulation. And yeah, in particular, I'd be excited about a world in which we end up having like a sort of well-defined like ecosystem of folks whose job it is to do auditing on algorithms that are important to the functioning of our society. Those people, I would like their career incentives to be such that they are, you know, they're incentivized to actually find the ways in which these algorithms might cause harm and how they could sort of benefit society more. And if we manage to set up that kind of system, that seems great to me. It seems likely that getting there will require some regulation, but I also think that getting there also benefits from a bunch of the things that sort of goes in this bucket of self-regulation. And so I think as in most industries, like quite often the way that standards are developed is that sort of the industry itself is the one that like is first sees the need to start pushing in favor of putting these kinds of things in place, and I think that's something that we see today. So we do see some companies that at least are you know, trying to do things that look like auditing their algorithms and trying to do things that look like making sure their systems aren't causing harm in the world. When they do that, they're developing best practice. They are developing an industry that tries to do these kinds of things, and I think that's, you know, that's that's a positive development, and hopefully we'll see more of it. I think it seems likely that we'll see even more of it over the next, I don't know what number of years as the EU starts pushing out its sort of proposed regulation, at least if it ends up looking like what was proposed by the Commission a few months ago. Yeah, so I guess sort of an overall an impression I would like not be excited about you leaving anyone leaving this thing with is like, oh, the reason that Markus worked on this particular question of like whether we should do broader impact statements is because it's the most important lever for us to pull to lead to better outcomes when it comes to how AI technology is used. I think that's not true, but I do think it's like one out of many levers that we ought to be trying to pull on and see what happens.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? I can't see any more questions in the chat. You got loads of good pointers to papers and other resources posted.
I think Bengt said somewhere sort of expecting sort of ML researchers or AI researchers to be sort of more have different kinds of ethics than folks who work on AI ethics. And I think that seems true to me. I don't know if we have data on this. I think we have some data on like people's political beliefs, and I would expect those to be in the direction of AI researchers tending to be more, at least in the US, tending more towards the sort of like the Democrat directions and whatnot. But I think that those sort of political beliefs might be slightly different from their ethical beliefs. Where I do think it seems true that sort of if I'm an AI researcher, I'm gonna maybe veer more towards maybe libertarian views, maybe slightly more towards the consequentialist views. Whereas if I'm an ethics researcher, my impression is that sort of it's more common that I sort of have stronger sort of intrinsic worries about things like fairness and inequality and injustice and those kind of things.
I think Ulle has his hand up. Ulle.
Yes, thank you. So Markus mentioned the proposal from the EU Commission on further regulation of AI technology. I'm wondering whether the panel is familiar with this and what their general reactions to the proposal is.
So I'm decently familiar with the regulation. I think, I tend to find it difficult to make statements about, or like have firm enough views so that I feel like I can make sort of clear statements about whether I would think something like this is positive or negative. My guess is it's where it looks like pretty decently formulated regulation to me, and my guess is it's a step in the right direction and that it will have positive impacts. In particular, the thing that I'm excited about is this thing that I mentioned previously of sort of pushing the sort of frontier of building up an industry of folks who can who can audit and who could judge whether certain AI research or whether certain AI applications are sort of causing harm to the world. As always, there will be a bunch of things that I would want to change in regulation like this. But overall, it seems likely to me that it's sort of moving in a positive direction.
So I had a question. They refused to say that that autonomous weapons was a red line, right? I'm not overly familiar with it, but there was some controversy when they released this. Is that true, or am I?
I mean, I think lethal autonomous weapons, as used by the military, was outside of the remit of this this like set of things. I don't know if this is true, but like in general, the EU doesn't do a lot of, they don't like sort of put their hands in sort of the military workings or sort of what the militaries of the member countries do. But I think I don't know if they comment anything about sort of the use of things that look like lethal autonomous weapons, or in the sort of in the use of like in policing or whatnot. Like that seems like a, you know, things like that seems like a potential sort of future application that we'll see, and yeah, maybe one would have wanted to see comment on that.
I mean, on that point, I think it's indeed that on the whole, you've seen a lot of areas of sort of AI governance, so in general, also internationally, that there seems to be sort of a parallel track between the civilian sort of sector applications and the explicitly military one, and they really sort of try to, in most places, try to sort of keep that apart, given sort of the geopolitical stakes. I think the EU did have, so I think it's in January or February, the European Parliament did have a separate sort of draft resolution where they called on sort of always preserving meaningful human control over autonomous weapons, or well, sort of not having fully autonomous lethal weapons. So there sort of are developments on that in parallel. I think there was some sort of controversy and discussion over the fact that there were conditions in the proposed EU regulation that would allow for sort of a range of situations where states would be able to use, yeah, sort of like active sort of like mass surveillance systems or things like that. And I think there's some suggestion that France was sort of pushing for that. But I get that would, on the surface, have less to do with sort of military sort of AI systems, although on the other hand, of course, a lot of these systems end up sort of bleeding back and forth or having sort of dual use applications. I think there's an interesting thing with the EU regulation, and I should sort of flag that I'm still sort of catching up a bit and not finished reading through all of it. There is some debate, so like that it would apply. Sorry, to come a bit to Markus' earlier point about complementary tools, this regulation would apply to sort of a range of systems, including those that are like deployed in EU countries or where the output is used to inform decisions in EU countries, but it would not necessarily apply to sort of the underlying research or yeah, AI researchers sort of which directions they're allowed. Like it doesn't impose moratoria on, at least as far as I understand, underlying research directions, which maybe is sort of a good thing, but then of course you start having potential discussions over whether there should be mechanisms to make researchers think about which directions they want to research, what are the potential sort of stakeholder interests or employer interests in determining that, and what, if anything, could be other mechanisms to complement that.
Thank you. Are there any more questions now in the final few minutes from the audience? I don't see any hands up. And I think we covered everything in the chat as well. So unless there is anyone wanting to have a very last question, I would like to thank the panelists very much for an interesting discussion and hand over back to Olle for a few concluding words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moa. Thank you for a wonderful panel discussion. Thank you, Markus. Thank you, Matthijs, and thank you, Mohammed, for excellent, informative presentations. From my point of view, this was a very successful afternoon, and I thank also all the participants in the audience for taking part in these discussions. I had just one final question for the three speakers. There seems to be some interest in seeing your slides again. So my question is, if you're willing to share them, just email them to me, and I will then be posting them on the workshop announcement page, which everyone has seen. And with that, I close this workshop. And again, thank you all for participating.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.